Our first speaker today is Vasilios Marinis, who is going to introduce the opening session. Vasilios is at the Institute of Sacred Music, and he will tell you a bit about his own work by way of introduction. So, welcome.
Good morning. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to all of you that braved the New England cold in order to be at this session entitled Revisioning, Redevelopment, Reconstruction, part of the conference Middle East, Middle Ground, Religious Sites in Urban Contexts. My name is Vasilios Marinis, and I'm Assistant Professor of Christian Art and Architecture at the Institute of Sacred Music and the Divinity School at Yale. I'm a Byzantinist and an architectural historian by training, and thus, being located in scholarly terms between the Middle East and the West, I foster enthusiasms for both French Gothic cathedrals and Ottoman mosques, especially of the 14th century. My specialization does have a significant drawback. The architects I deal with have been dead for at least 600 years. So it has been a great pleasure to meet and converse with so many of you in New Haven over this weekend. As I was preparing these introductory remarks, I could not help but thinking that the three words in this session's title, Revisioning, Redevelopment, Reconstruction, summarize succinctly, despite the intellectual cacophony of the middle one, much of our classroom discourse when it comes to architectural history. Beyond dates and construction techniques, architectural style, and availability of material, we teach that each building is the result of a negotiation between inherited social, religious, and cultural structures and individual agency. Structures in the case of, let's say, a Byzantine church entailed canonical regulations extended and informed by theological developments which guided church building, as well as considerations for the accommodation of ritual and symbolic divisions of space. Individual agency refers to the desires of patrons, masons, and, of course, architects. Yet this captures a building only at the moment of its inception and creation. It presents it as a product of certain historical, social, and pragmatic contexts and circumstances. But if indeed buildings are also social constructs, never finished, but always becoming, then revisions and reconstructions, fluidity and flexibility, constitute intrinsic parts of their nature. They are often reimagined and reused in ways that differ dramatically from the original intentions of buildings and patrons. Certainly, historical hindsight, especially of the recent postmodern kind, helps alleviate the angst of this realization for both students and professors, and occasionally architects. Many historic structures bear the scar of such fate. I pick an easy example. Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Turkey, built in the 6th century by Emperor Justinian. For Orthodox Christians, it is the quintessential cathedral, one of unsurpassed beauty. For some Muslims, it is the Great Mosque, a marker of the might and glory of the Ottoman Empire. And recently, after its conversion to a museum by Kemal Atatürk, Hagia Sophia became, for secularist Turks, the symbol of the secular republic. The list can grow exponentially. Hagia Sophia has been revisioned, remodeled, and symbolically transplanted from Russia to Bulgaria and from the south side of Chicago to Washington, D.C. It is therefore with great anticipation that I'm looking forward to this morning's papers, which will address practical and theoretical aspects of the issues outlined in the session's title. Therefore, it gives me real great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Peter Eisenman. Professor Eisenman is an internationally recognized architect and educator. The principal of Eisenman Architects, he has designed large-scale housing and urban design projects, innovative facilities for educational institutions, and a series of inventive private houses. Professor Eisenman has taught at Cambridge University, Harvard, Princeton, Ohio State, the Cooper Union, and he is currently in the faculty of the Yale School of Architecture. His many books include Eisenman, Inside Out, Selected Writings, Blurred Zones, Investigations of the Interstitial Eisenman Architects 1998, and many more. From 1967 to 1982, he was the director of the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York City, which he founded. The title of his talk today is Parsifal and the Staging of Contemporary Christianity. Please join me in welcoming Professor Eisenman.
Before I begin, a confession. When I was first asked by Carla, I said I know nothing about the Middle East and I know nothing about religious spaces, and, get someone else. The dean persuaded her and me that I should be here, and for that, since I found something that I really am interested in, I am very thankful. So thank you, Carla, for pursuing me, and thank you for Robert for twisting my arm on my leave. In any case, what I found was that I realized that this conference was being sponsored by an institution dealing with music, and I'm an amateur interested in music, and I recently watched a staging of Parsifal at Bayreuth this summer. And as I was to find out, Fal Parsi in Arabic means dumb fool or something like that. So that's where the name comes from. So I've got an Arabic title. The Knights Templar, with whom Parsifal was associated, were housed, as it were, in Palestine. And so therefore, my subject is both musical and Middle Eastern. Whether it's architecture or not is another question. And it's certainly, if nothing else, I took the title Reconstruction and replaced the R with a D, which I thought was appropriate given the notion of contemporaneity. So I am going to be talking about the staging of contemporary Christianity, or as Jean-Luc Nancy has written in his recent book, the disenclosure of Christianity, which is in fact the deconstruction of its conceptual bases. Two caveats. First, the brief for the symposium suggests that there has been a paradigm shift in the relationship between architecture and religion. As will be seen from what follows, I do not think this is so. If in fact there has been a paradigm shift, it is in our understanding of what constitutes, for lack of a better term, the philosophic conceptions of Christianity. This is nowhere more apparent than in the contemporary staging of Christianity, as seen in Richard Wagner's opera Parsifal. And if staging can be considered a vehicle of expression for this paradigm shift, then we are dealing with space and time, hence architecture. But the shift that I'm going to talk about, while it involves ideas about religion, is in fact a secular and not a religious shift in terms of a sacred context. For it must be remembered that Parsifal, the last of Wagner's operas, was originally thought to be the most Christian, so much so that it was only supposed to be performed at the sacred shrine of the Bayreuth Festspiel House. Second caveat, in the late 1950s, the painter Barnett Newman was asked to participate in an exhibition on Jewish painting at the New York City Jewish Museum. Newman declined the invitation, saying there was no such thing as Jewish painting. More recently, in the late 1990s, I was asked to participate in an exhibition of Jewish architecture. I respectfully declined, like Barnett Newman before me, saying that there was no such thing as Jewish architecture. In other words, my argument that follows suggests that there's no such thing as a specific religious context to either painting or a building. There is no question that this symposium has been organized with respect to what I believe can be called the context of literal sacred space, i.e. churches, mosques, and synagogues devoted to liturgical performance. But can these places in themselves ever be more than what they are, no less represent a paradigm shift? And of course, that's what the conference is about. For me, however, they are what they are in that they must in some way maintain the possibility of their rituals, which have been sustained, albeit transformed, over time. Having said that, I would like to think I am here because I have perhaps been part of a potential paradigm shift through my involvement with the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, i.e. a concept of place devoted to the memory of the genocide of a people. Thus, the issue raised by the memorial and the subject of its commemoration is race, not religion. After all, the final solution was based on an issue of a master race and an inferior race. Genocide, in this case, has little concern for religion per se, or whether someone was a practicing Jew or not. For me, the Berlin Memorial has always been a secular space as opposed to a sacred one. Unlike a church or a cemetery, the memorial, because of its particular history, makes a distinction between what Giorgio Agamben has called an archival memory and an ineffable one, but in neither case, a religious one. And if we can segue briefly from Berlin to Bayreuth, it was because of issues of race and not religion per se that Hitler was fascinated by Wagner's Ring Cycle, and not necessarily because of Wagner's overt anti-Semitism in his writings or his covert anti-Semitism played out in many of the central characters of his operas. As early as 1924, when Bayreuth reopened after a 10-year hiatus due to the First World War and its aftermath, already Nazi influences, which at that time were only a faint murmur in Germany after Hitler's imprisonment in the failed beer hall putsch, were quite active in Bayreuth. Hitler, to great fanfare, attended the reopening in 1924, and Jews, both as performers and audience members, were excluded. Parenthetically, this caused a financial crisis at Bayreuth, since many of the major subscribers and patrons at that time had been Jewish. This nationalistic, romantic, sentimental, and racial fervor, i.e. Wagner's putative Germanness, only increased after the Nazi takeover of power in January of 1933. In particular, the Nazi Parteitage in nearby Nuremberg, famously celebrated in Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will of 34, always opened with a performance of Wagner's Die Meistersinger, followed by Hitler's attendance at the opening of the Ring Cycle in Bayreuth. Clearly, all of these influences had to be expunged after the war, though through what was a twofold movement. One, a movement from representation of the characters as Nordic gods to Greek sculptures, and two, a movement from the ritualistic to the psychoanalytic role of the narrative. In doing so, the traditional interpretation of Christian rituals were muted and transformed into psychological events. This was the beginning of the secularization of Parsifal and other such performances of Christianity through, ironically, the erasure of National Socialism. Can I get the light so I can put some slides on? Yes. They on, okay. Yeah, I got it. Oh, got it. All right. I've been away from academia, so. Got it. No, it's called Alzheimer's, Bob. There's my guest. So nice of you to come. Yes, well, you know, we are. Okay, this is the staging of Parsifal in its 1882, its first production at Bayreuth, conducted by Hermann Levi, who was in fact a son of a rabbi. And when this was who Wagner wanted to conduct, but he said, look, Mr. Levi, you have to convert to Christianity, even though Wagner himself believed that that conversion created people more radical than before. Levi refused and still conducted this first Parsifal. And this is the first, on the right is the first Grail Hall, which is based on a version of Siena Cathedral. We have the 1927, the third year after the reopening, the staging of Parsifal and Act 1 on the left, and Furtwängler's staging in 1937, again in Act 1. And of course, I'm showing you these to see the enormous difference between what was seen in the 20s and what will be seen, what was seen this year. The next slide shows the movement clearly from Nordic gods to Greek statuary, and this is early in 1961 after the this change that had to take place, the denazification of Bayreuth. The symbolism now in 1977, which was still very overt, iconic imagery, because Parsifal was one of the important icons of Bayreuth, and here we see Christ on a cross, which is completely expunged from the production of last summer. Here we get a more contemporary interpretation. We're now in 2004, and the Holy Grail and the Templars are now seen as victims moving from a concentration camp. This is in 2004. And then we get to this Herrheim's staging, which I saw, which began in 2008 to 2010, and we begin to see a very big difference. In the center is the young Parsifal, and the elder statesman of the Knights Templar with wings, Gouvernements. Okay, so with this as a historical background, the editors of Die Zeit, the German newspaper, proposed that I attend the ring cycle in Bayreuth. They do this every year, taking someone outside of the music profession and asking them to participate with Die Zeit in a critique of what was seen. Slavoj Žižek, who I will quote later in the paper, preceded me. Michel Houellebecq, the controversial French writer, was before Žižek. And so I was intrigued by this offer to spend a week at Bayreuth and participate in some way in producing a critique. I was to write about Parsifal. Now, my first reaction was trepidation, not because I know little about music. I cannot sing, I cannot carry a tune, I cannot dance a step, much to the chagrin of my wife, but because I remain a great Wagner fan, having seen most of his other operas performed live in New York or Vienna, and in fact probably 7 or 8 complete ring cycles. I have, perhaps for emotional reasons, never gone to see Parsifal. While going to Bayreuth ostensibly to see the ring cycle conducted by someone other than James Levine provoked in some sense a once-in-a-lifetime eager anticipation, the thought of also seeing Parsifal presented something of a problem. If this opera were as overtly anti-Semitic as it had been portrayed in many past productions, what would I, as the architect of the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, be required to say? Could I not notice, or could I indeed ignore, the received anti-Semitic history associated with its production, not to mention the shadows cast by the rise of National Socialism both in Nuremberg and at the Festspielhaus itself? Could I confess ignorance or professional naivete? Hardly. Fortunately, it was the particular production of Parsifal itself that gave me a chance to comment, but in an entirely other than previously unthought context. And since I am an architect, I wanted just to say what the physical experience of being there was. The exterior of the Festspielhaus, either as designed by Wagner or in its present state, is unremarkable. The interior, with its stadium seating, double and triple proscenia, and hidden orchestra, is by present architectural as opposed to technical standards quite dowdy. What comes to mind are Scharoun's Philharmonie in Berlin and Semper's Dresden Opera as important architecturally. I know the Festspielhaus is supposed to be impeccably acoustically tuned to Wagnerian production, but if you cannot see the stage because there is a head of hair in front of you shifting constantly from side to side, the oral experience is somehow less enjoyable. Not to mention that without the subtitles provided at the Metropolitan, one really doesn't know what one is listening to. But enjoyment or pleasure is not the primary motivation for the experience of the Ring. Having said all that, it is Wagner's thesis on the importance of performance and its affect that one must turn in order to consider what happened in the staging of Parsifal. Performance is a complex idea. In one sense, performance is original in its status as an event, but it's equally never original in that it's always the production of something prior, be it a script, a score, or even another production. Thus, performance is an ambiguous concept. Yet the idea of originality, and yes, purity, seems always to be on the lips of all the Wagner-philes when they make their annual pilgrimage to their Valhalla, Bayreuth, to witness the sacred rituals, sacred of summertime rites of the Ring cycle and other Wagner operas. These purists often argue that Wagner should be strictly performed according to 19th century standards, as if such an event were even possible. Since all performance is unique, if not original, which of the many single instances would qualify? Fortunately, what was witnessed in the summer of 2010 cycle held nothing of the sentimental nostalgia required by such a purist mentality. But this does not mean that all went smoothly. Some of the stage effects in the Ring cycle, while important to the collapse of narrative time and space, seemed symbolically empty, done merely for the novelty of affect. For example, in Götterdämmerung, the Rhine maidens flopped about in a nasty urban culvert and gratuitous graffiti, which only seemed a distraction, even amusement. But it is to Parsifal that this talk throws open its critical interest. Parsifal is at base a story of a wandering, errant, rather foolish knight in search of the Holy Grail. This is only a thinly veiled pretext for a theme of redemption and salvation. By its many characters, Amfortas, Kundry, Gurnemanz, and Klingsor, fulfill other symbolic roles, which, as Wagner himself has said, was for the consecration of the stage. The idea of performance also is the heart and soul of Wagner's idea of opera as a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art, in that it unifies through performance the libretto and the score, which rarely operate as such a unity. Perhaps what has previously kept me from Parsifal is that I had supposed I would be participating in an actual ritual, the celebration of a romantic medieval Christian transcendence, and not the staging or representation of one. What I did actually witness was something other, no longer in its sacred religious context, but not rather quite secular and transformational. And as far as the all but distant echoes of anti-Semitism, of which this performance was stripped, it was no longer a problem. It's against this background, though, of Wagner's apodictic anti-Semitism supposedly culminating in Parsifal that I ventured to my seat. Somehow, Wagner's own prohibition that it be produced in any other place Bayreuth must have also unconsciously affected my own lifelong aversion to bearing witness to any of its stagings. The performance was engaging from its first notes, but it was the concluding sequences of the last two acts of Parsifal that were both stunningly staged and brilliant in their symbolism, and could have only been staged as such in Germany. Returning to the slides. Again, here is still the first act of the young Parsifal, and you will notice, you will notice the bed, this symbolic bed, which becomes, in the end, a coffin, but where transformation takes place. At one time it's Parsifal, at another time it's Amfortas, who is the aging head of the Grail, and another time it's Kundry, the seductress woman, who symbolically in Wagner liturgy is supposed to be Jewish, and therefore the dark seductress. All three of them appear in this simultaneously, let's say, in space, in this bed. Now, here's the scene in the second act where Parsifal, in his now grown-up sailor suit, is attacked by Red Cross nurses who used to be flower maidens and are now operating a hospital brothel, which is quite extraordinary from the sort of purist interpretation. Here is the hospital brothel, and of course, what you're not seeing in the detail is that these red banners had Nazi swastikas, and you didn't know if you were in the Great Hall of German Art or where one was, actually. The next staging is the Klingsor. Here is Kundry. Too complicated for me. Kundry is also red hair. You know that Parsifal's red hair, Amfortas is red hair, so they all can equally turn into one another. Here is the disruption by Klingsor, the evil spirit who was denied access to the rights of the Knights of Templar, the Holy Grail, and there's the destruction of the hospital. And here is the hospital again after this destruction, the symbolic destruction of Germany. There is the bed, and we have Parsifal, Gundry, and Gurnemans as some sort of survivors of a desperate time in German history. And here is Kundry now, and we think it's Kundry because it could be Amfortas. It's always not clear in this staging because Amfortas goes to bed. We know when it's Amfortas because he's got a crown of thorns in his long hair, but he also has a wound in his side from the spear like the wound in Christ's side. And of course there in the background is the swastika, sort of, again, symbolic of this place that has been destroyed, this brothel hospital, and the only remaining person is Kundry Amfortis. And now, at the end, we are transported from the hospital. The bed still remains. We are now in the Bundestag, and we have Parsifal and Amfortis now in the bed. The elder Knight of the Grail, the Grail being back here. And we there see, Parsifal in his sailor suit, and Amfortis with his crown of thorns in the chaotic condition of the Bundestag. And then we go to Kurnamas, Parsifal, and Kundry, and now Parsifal looks like Kundry, looks like Amfortis. It's not clear. And then we have Parsifal over here with the sword, which needs to touch the wound in the side of Amfortis, who's now, his hair is shorn. He's a member of the Bundestag. And so you can see, if you don't understand what the words are, and of course this has nothing to do with the libretto, which I had read beforehand, so it was quite off-putting in one sense. I realized that I had no capacity to understand other than to see these very vivid images. So the Brotherhood of the Grail first becomes what would appear to be a Nazi party rally with long vertical red banners, which we saw festooned with characteristic swastikas lining the stage. While in the last act, that same setting of the Brotherhood of the Grail becomes the Bundestag in Berlin, sometimes in 1920s, sometimes in the 1960s. Hanging over the stage in this act is a large canted round mirror. And you see this mirror which reflects the Bundestag and the sort of now become the Knights of the Grail. This mirror reflects the action below, where a coffin draped with a German flag is solemnly carried in. Amfortis, ruler of the Grail Kingdom, now dressed in a business suit, has been with his hair cut, but still wearing a crown of thorns as a Christ-like figure, opens the casket to find the crumbling remains of humanity. Finally does Parsifal's late awakening after Kundry's kiss then redeem humanity, Germany. In the performance's final climactic gesture, all religious symbolism is effaced as the giant reflective disc what happens is that this disc now turns, I don't have a picture exactly of it, but it turns to the audience to reflect in the giant cyclops the self-refraction of audience members who now become the performers, gazing up on themselves. And in this moment, redemption is offered, and ultimately only possible outside of the religious rituals of Christianity or the stage, made secular and political as portrayed in this final act of moving from the stage to the audience itself. Ultimately, any performance of Parsifal today stands or falls intellectually and conceptually on the paradigm shifts that have taken place between its staging and German history itself. The performance of redemption so necessarily de-Christianized as to make one feel almost uncomfortable in its absence. But it is also to contemporary philosophy, and more specifically the post-structuralist concept of the idea of a text or textuality, that one must turn to understand what the author Alain Badiou has called the deconstruction of Christianity. A text, unlike a narrative, is the opposite of a Gesamtkunstwerk. It is only ever partially complete, non-unitary, and often hidden. Any libretto and score are potentially textual in the sense that they are incomplete without performance. But it is precisely traditional performance itself that has been seen as a denial of such a textuality, because it is the performance that provides the stable unity denied, as the performance of any ritual, the stable unity denied in the duality of libretto and score. How else, for example, can one understand the libretto today, which has turned the flower maiden singing in Klingsor's garden into Red Cross nurses acting as prostitutes in a brothel-like hospital? Here the words and the actions become truly textual. But this does not mean that Wagner has furnished us with this idea, with a text. On the contrary, his idea of a Gesamtkunstwerk is precisely an attempt to overcome this idea. Wagner clearly remains in the realm of the totalizing idea of the aesthetic as a total work of art, as opposed to what Badiou calls the effectless effect. A text, then, is always ultimately conceptual and thus open to supplemental readings. These readings produce transformations from the original, even when, in the case of opera, the original score and libretto are adhered to in the performance. This is because the music often reiterates what the libretto has said. Thus, in Wagner, as Adorno has said, the Gesamtkunstwerk idea is doomed to failure. Redemption in the Christian sense can never be used as a unifying principle. The staging of the third act of Parsifal produced both a conceptual and affective ending without the traditional sentimental heroics of redemption. Nonetheless, the possibility of a religious space is part of the myth of Parsifal, and thus the danger in what I witness in such a staging of the denial of the myth of redemption is that in its secularization it may not adequately reduce or deny these mythic and religious aspects. Redemption, which is another form of transformation, can only take place when there is a possibility of unity. Redemption as a healing or Christian unifying principle is thought to be at the heart of Parsifal. Yet according to Slavoj Žižek, who preceded me at Bayreuth, he reverses the standard comparison between the Ring and Parsifal and says that the Ring that Wagner comes closest, it is in the Ring that Wagner comes closest to Christianity, whereas Parsifal, he says, stages an obscene retranslation of Christianity as a black mask, a pagan ritual. One must not forget that the name of Jesus Christ is never uttered in the libretto of Parsifal. And Stefan Hersheim's staging of Parsifal at Bayreuth underscores that any such resolution is of necessity problematic. If this idea can be accepted, then no matter the history of Bayreuth or for that matter Wagner and his avowed anti-Semitism, this staging of Parsifal presents another phenomenon, one that questions Wagner's insistence on performance as an affective means of restoring the unity of libretto and score. In these terms, what was witnessed at Bayreuth was nothing short of transformative, because, as was said before, while the cast was singing a narrative libretto about a metaphysical, mythic, and ultimately religious redemption, what is simultaneously being seen is a highly complex secular enactment that turns Wagner's desired unity of the Gesamtkunstwerk into a text, transforms it from a stable narrative into a tissue of traces. This is the supplement that is always latent in any narrative form, but particularly so in the context of a libretto and score in opera. Staging here questions both place and time and their narrative condition by transforming them into undecidable textual material. In this context, the staging of redemption can never be certain, but at least it can be put into question. This is why both Jean-Luc Nancy and Badiou see Parsifal as an attempt to deconstruct Christianity itself. For Badiou, such a deconstruction means something that reaffirms in a different way, in the sense of a radical critique, our received notions of faith. Badiou says that the interpretation of Parsifal in Wagner's day in the late 19th century would fail in this sense because the so-called redemption of the Redeemer was not possible since a pure and simple mythologizing of Christianity had not yet come about. Today, the philosophic deconstruction of Christianity in the staging of Parsifal becomes possible because the roots of its mythology have been placed in a secular as opposed to a sacred framework. This is precisely what the present production of Parsifal attempts to do. Symbolic of its undecidability is the central figure of Amfortas, lying center stage in a bed, who becomes at one moment both Kundry and Christ. As Gurnemann says to Parsifal at the end of Act 2, time and space have become one. Textuality, therefore, is a form of a paradigm shift, and if Wagner introduces the text of the pagan other as a foil to an unambiguous Christianity, then this forming of the other must be considered as the secular aspect of a sacred other. Thus, the question that this performance of Parsifal asks, like Nietzsche, according to Badiou, which resonates in the staging, is there something beyond Christianity? Thank you very much.
I get my toys together so I can move.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Our second speaker today is Hashim Sarkis, who is the Aga Khan Professor of Landscape Architecture and Urbanism in Muslim Societies at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he teaches design, studios, and courses in the history and theory of architecture. Sarkis is a practicing architect between Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Lebanon. His projects include a housing complex for the fishermen of Tyre, a park in downtown Beirut, 2 schools in the North Lebanon region, and several urban and landscape projects. He is the author of several books and articles, including 1958, Lebanon in the Pictures of Plans of Konstantinos Doxiadis. His paper today is entitled Not Faith in Architecture, The Case of Beirut. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sarkis.
Good morning. Thank you for this very kind invitation and for this very stimulating conference. I speak about Beirut, not Beirut. Why is it that when people seek a spatial articulation of the condition of religious plurality, they often go to Beirut? And why is it that the most vivid illustration of this plurality of religious identity is when the spatial articulations themselves are destroyed? Why is it that the notion of religious pluralism in the Middle East is essentialized to the point of friction and violence and elevated to ideological difference? Whereas in a context, for example, like the United States, and even if someone like John Rawls would place religious plurality as a fact that is elevated almost to a constitutional value, it still remains in the realm of the private. Why is it that when we want to explain terrorist attacks in the Middle East, we seek an explanation in religious ideology, whereas like in the bombings in Oklahoma City or in the recent attacks in Arizona, when violence takes place in the United States, we immediately resort to the private madness of the attacker. I speak about Beirut with some confidence, even when I'm mistaken, rather especially when I'm mistaken, to admit that for too long I have been looking for evidence, or similar evidence, of this plurality in architecture. But as we all know, the nature of evidence is such that when you look for it, you find it. But most of the evidence that I and others have been basing their views of religious plurality in terms of architecture and urbanism has to do with rituals, not really with space. But if the rituals themselves are different, I assure you that the Christians of Beirut walk, talk, and build in a very, very similar and indistinguishable way from its Muslims. I returned to Beirut, therefore, in order to challenge these preconceptions that I had before, but to show that another aspect of religion, what I will be referring to as a condition of worldliness, which is distinct from secularism, may be an underlying drive behind Beirut's urban morphogenesis. Religion not outside of reason, not without evidence, but as a set of values that guide action ahead of evidence. This is a view that is shared across periods and across thinkers from different religious denominations like Charles Peirce, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Jean-Paul Sartre, and even Ibn Rushd. On February 12, 2005, a yellow balloon was launched into the sky of Beirut. It was a tethered helium balloon brought from France, where the prototype, which is located in Parc Citroën, was a popular and commercial success. More in line with the Berlin version of the balloon, however, Beirut's was placed at the edge of the city's downtown, a large construction site of 1,500,000 meters square, where visitors would be able to go up 300 meters above sea level and monitor the progress of the city's transformation and project their own images on a very large void. The site installation consisted of a folded ground plane, folded in order to solve the problem of the diagonally sloping site and to house the waiting areas, the restaurants and game rooms, which would otherwise encumber the operations of the balloon. The whole structure was made out of concrete, but meant to be temporary. Concrete remains the cheapest way to build in Lebanon. It was located on one of the parcels that had been cleared and amplified to absorb large-scale towers. Many of the adjacent sites had also been leased for entertainment uses and filled with activities like cycling, horseback riding, and go-cars. In this case, it was a balloon. But the idea I advanced as the architect of the project was to keep the space clear and open, like the surroundings, for different possibilities of use as a public space, and in order not to clutter it with themes and scenographies. The multiple and intersecting layers of ground planes multiplied these possibilities. 2 days later after the launch, on February 14, 2005, and at 300 horizontal meters from the balloon, Lebanon's former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri and the leader of an opposition movement against Syrian hegemony at the time was assassinated in a massive explosion that ripped through his shielded car and scorched a deep crater in the street. Several assassinations followed, including one of a famous journalist, Samir Asir, and chronicler of Beirut's history. An international tribunal has been formed to gather evidence and to identify and try the assassins. Since then, the country has been polarized into a group favoring the pursuit of justice, even if Syria is implicated, and another group favoring a real politics of sorts towards Syria and towards the fragile regional and local balance. The rest is yet to become history. Immediately after the assassination, however, several apocryphal accounts linked the balloon to the crime. One story told of a detonating device found in the balloon. Another claimed that the assassins took flight in the balloon, neglecting the glaring fact that it was still there, tied to the ground. Compared to its impact on the country, the actual impact of the explosion on the balloon was rather minimal. Had it not been in mid-air on a test run at that very moment, it would have no doubt exploded. There's a picture of one of the balloon operators who's trained as a mountain climber, fixing the balloon after a leak was discovered as a result of a shrapnel, which came from the explosion. For a month after the assassination, the balloon was grounded until the criminal investigations and the state of emergency in the city were over. During that period, it served as a marker for the crowds that spontaneously gathered around it to walk from the site of assassination to Martyrs Square, where Hariri was buried, right on the site next to the mosque that Nasser showed last night. The balloon also appeared on the cover of a novel about that period, where it symbolized a certain unbearable lightness in face of the weight of the events. Putting aside these circumstantial and conspiratorial links, a happy helium balloon on a patch of grass in the city's center would appear to be the perfect antithesis to the act that it witnessed. The contrast between the two recounts yet another myth, equally apocryphal, about Beirut's constant cycle between good times and violence. The myth, which we all somehow believe and participate in, goes that Beirut has been condemned to destruction because it transgressed. It overindulged in hedonism and excess. And these cycles continue to happen at a closer pace until they converge into images like this, which the media loves to represent and use to illustrate Beirut. This is not Beirut's only curse. A structural fault exists in the country's composition and geographic location. Ethnically divided between Christian and Muslim, geographically located between the Mediterranean and Arabia, again I refer to Nasser's definition of the Middle East. There is, however, hardly any city that does not explain its morphogenesis without resorting to a kind of strategic geopolitical status of in-between. But here in Beirut, the very dichotomy provides the city with a raison d'être and with a raison de ne pas être. But is there anything to say about Beirut outside these exceptional conditions? Is it possible to speak of a city that has come to embody disaster and division and religious pluralism that leads to disaster and division without talking about disaster and division? Is it possible to chart out a normal path for Beirut? The curses of religious essentialization, of exception and specificity, make it impossible to learn from Beirut, let alone from any other place. Ultra-theoretical practices prevail in the explanation of Beirut's fate. These explanations reject the structural organization of events in favor of the circumstantial. An incident, in other words, could only be explained by linking it to another incident that precedes it. It is not their fault, I would say. Beirut itself generates unstructured incidents, they would say. Precariousness has been used to explain everything from the social situation to the chaos of the built environment. But this approach is neither reassuring nor is it helpful for someone examining the circumstances around which a city is built. You can arrive at that kind of conclusion by simply uttering the word Beirut. Some other interpreters have read these polar extremes as exaggerations of modern pathologies. Science fiction writer J.G. Ballard describes Beirut in his story War Fever as the only place on a perpetually peaceful earth in the future that was deliberately kept at war as a United Nations laboratory for studying violent impulses in human beings. Even when this reading situates Beirut on top of the world as its pressure valve, it somehow essentializes the connection between violence and place this time, in a manner that is not productive either, at least not for Beirut. For that, I would like to get off these paths of interpretation of Beirut move away from self-fulfilling particularities, and extract logics of the production of architecture and the physical space of the city from building practices, in vivo, as it were. This is slightly different from the Lefebvre or Harvey notion of spatial production. Because as much as I believe that the social is indelibly linked to the spatial, I also believe that space is constitutive of the social, not simply shaped by it, and that the physical environment exudes its own desirability. By production of space here, I mean how architects and urban planners make buildings and public spaces, and how these practices are linked to other spatial actions in the city, such as owning property, destroying it, parking a car, and putting up a sign on a building. In many ways, this comes close to art historian Svetlana Alper's distinction between describing what the artist works within and what the artist works with. And I'm trying to concentrate on what the architect works with. Now, questions of religious identity, of ethnicity, and violence may very well come up, and I will focus in some of the examples on religious buildings, but only insofar as they appear on the table of the architect, as he or she makes decisions about the forms of the city. I will therefore concentrate on what makes it to this table, on real estate, urban design, regulations, iconographies, and stylistic practices, working my way from the balloon project to explicate the logics of these practices and their overlaps. Admittedly, all of these practices do come with strong religious and ideological baggage, with excess baggage, but they also generate their own dynamics. These practices and the forms they generate may turn out to produce a sense of similarity, I would even say sameness, within the city and with other cities around the world. This may teach us more poignant lessons about contemporary urbanism than the specificities of Beirut would allow. But let me not get ahead of myself. In seeking a Beirut normal, I am also forging a continuity between the normative aspects of the city and the pathological, following Georges Canguilhem. I dwell a bit on Canguilhem because what is very interesting in his writing about that distinction between the normal and the pathological is that he shows that in science biases, the normal is understood to be a way of operating or practicing under one set of norms, whereas he distinguishes that from the normative to call for a condition where there are multiple ways of normative approaches, and the normative is simply a way of being able to adapt. So the normative is about ability to adapt to different conditions, whereas the pathological is only able to deal with one set of conditions. And in that sense, I think the Canguilhem definition of the normative could be very helpful here. When the client was given the choice between two adjacent sites to lease, he chose the lower one, which was further away from the highway exit, more accessible from the city's hotels, and less likely to be sold than the higher site. The lower one being, he was given the choice between these two. Thank you, sir. Yep, he chose this instead of that. The site lies in the heart of Beirut's glittering hotel district of the 1950s and 60s. It was also the major battle in the 1975 Civil War. The remnants of that battle still remain on the infamous Holiday Inn building standing in Beirut, still designed by Andrei Wojnarowski. Once the war stopped, the site was included in the master plan of Solidaire, the real estate holding company in charge of the reconstruction of downtown Beirut. Some of the hotels outside the Solidaire boundary, like the Holiday Inn, the Saint Georges, remain bullet-ridden, standing as daunting lessons, according to the supporters of Solidaire, of what could have happened to the downtown had Solidaire not been invented. To empower Solidaire, special legal and fiscal mechanisms were created. Former property owners in the old downtown became shareholders in this private real estate company, including the religious endowments of the Sunnis and Greek Orthodox that owned considerable amount of the property. And the company was charged with developing and executing a reconstruction plan. All this has been labeled special and unique, but historically it actually falls in a consistent and long pattern of development in the city. I also would like to argue that it also falls within practices that were deemed important in order to build the modern city by early modernist planners, remember the Plan Voisin, but also very similar to the way that religious endowments operate with their property in this city. A major dynamic in urban development in Lebanon is based on the fact that the value of the land is often much higher than the value of the buildings that sit upon it. While location and size, as is always the case, do figure prominently in the evaluation of property, the historical value of buildings does not contribute as much to the assessment of property. Given a weak mortgage market, almost non-existent, and relatively low property taxes, investment and speculation in real estate can continue even if the demand is not high and even if there are war conditions in the city. Real estate still provides the most secure sector for investment in spite of a vacancy rate that reaches about 30%, particularly in luxury residential buildings. With zoning and the building code that get constantly revised to increase exploitation in different ways, it is difficult to imagine how older, historically significant buildings can withstand the pressure of speculation. In a 3-volumed historical novel, Beirut World City, Rabia Jaber recounts the story of the city's transformation through a family saga stretching between 1830 to 1860, the period when Beirut was taken up by Ibrahim Pasha of Egypt, the son of Muhammad Ali Pasha, who was in Nasser's story yesterday, as a base for his insurgents against the Ottomans. And when the city turned around from serving as the border station between Tripoli and Sidon provinces to becoming its own center. The urban transformations in the city were immense and erased much of the medieval residues, including the city walls. That's in a very protracted period of 30 years. Upon their return, 10 years later, the Ottomans reaffirmed their presence by further clearings as part of the effort to modernize the city's infrastructure and edify their imperial presence. Up to then, the Ottomans somehow ignored the city. The Ottomans did not have time to fill the clearing that they had created. The French mandate and the clearing that the Ottomans created is this, which is quite vast, and that. The French mandate from 1918 to 1943 finished the job and created new sites for the city's expansion. But there was really no real investment until the 1936 uprising. It was really the demographic and congestion pressures on the newly created capital city that vacated in the downtown in the 1960s towards new commercial centers at the fringes. Several proposals for clearing and rebuilding the downtown were entertained during this period, supported by justifications similar to those used during urban renewal here in the United States, but also by the geographic constraints to growth that come in the shape of Mount Lebanon, a condition that Beirut shares with many Mediterranean cities. It was really finally the 1975-1990 civil war that ultimately destroyed the center and then brought it back into the cycle of real estate clearings. The Solidaire plan for 4.7 million square meters of built-up area in downtown Beirut should be understood within this pattern. Now, outside of Solidaire, the same pattern occurs, but at a smaller scale, perhaps with the exception of the recent reconstruction of the southern suburbs after the Israeli bombing in 2006. Buildings dating back to the 1950s and 60s, such as these, are routinely torn down and replaced by parking lots, as owners play a waiting game with prospective developers. These clearings serve as development indices, particularly in neighborhoods like Ras Beirut and Ashrafiyeh, where competing claims and scenarios for development help increase the value of the vacated property as the owners wait out on it and allow for fusing it with other neighboring property. And in many ways, I would propose that the religious endowments or religious buildings enter into this particular game of clearing or creating vital voids in at least 3 ways. The first is that, again, the way that religious endowments are administered enters into this game, holding on to property and then investing in it, once the cycle allows. Secondly is that religious buildings today, especially in the downtown plan, stand themselves as clearings. Compared to the height of the buildings around them, they themselves create this kind of isolated space and help in the increase of the value of the property around them. Now, in most cases, these buildings that have been cleared, again, like the Plan Voisin, in order to stand out as icons within the city, the religious endowments that own these buildings also tend to own some of the property around them. And so you can imagine that this is kind of self-feeding way of increasing the value of the real estate. The other way in which, and this happens not only in downtown Beirut but also outside, these are the new old mosques, Crusader church turned mosque in downtown Beirut, which has been cleared of the shops and buildings around it in order to stand separated from the street by a park, but also becomes a clearing within the downtown in order to improve the value of the buildings around it. This rather bad image shows that this was not the condition before, that these buildings were completely embedded in the fabric. But this is the scale of the clearing today in downtown Beirut. At least now it's being built up. But you can see that with the exception of the French mandate carpet, most of the buildings that remained were the religious buildings. And this image here showing 1, 2, 3 religious buildings within the vast clearing of the downtown. There are many more. And this just to show you an illustration of the pattern by which those clearings happen outside of the downtown, where you can see many of these voids, and then they get grouped together in order to create property and investment that is much larger than the pieces of development that exist before. And because of the building code, they can now amplify the development next to these buildings. A process of amplification that is not dissimilar to what goes on with mosques and churches. This is a church that exists outside of the downtown, but that during the war was destroyed, and when the Greek Orthodox Archbishop decided to rebuild it, he added an additional floor below it. So he built it to look like the old church, but he amplified it both in terms of its visibility, but also for real estate purposes. In 2007, less than 2 years after the balloon was launched, and despite the quagmire following the Israeli bombing, Solidaire sold the site parcel to a Dubai-based bank. Investors at that time from the Arabian Gulf were so confident in the Gulf model of development, they were developing projects in such high-risk places as Somalia, Sudan, and Lebanon. The balloon was briskly moved at dawn to a site nearby, but the continuing political tensions forced the owner to eventually deflate it and send it to the Gulf, where it is still sitting folded somewhere inside a container, waiting for the Gulf economy to come around. The contractor who built the balloon project was hired to destroy it. He sent me these pictures taken with a rather sadistic cell phone. Ironically, and because of the Gulf recession, the site has now been bought back and is becoming the site for a residential tower by Herzog and de Meuron. I had not myself anticipated that the clearing I worked to maintain could itself be cleared. Now, could this speculative approach in real estate, I ask, be elevated to an aesthetic without it imagining its own inevitable destruction? Could the constant reprojection of Beirut become an overture rather than frustration for architects? How can we make firm steps into a Heraclitean river that keeps changing? The balloon landing park was designed to be a park, a public space, for the duration of its short life. It was a direct response to one of Beirut's endemic problems, the lack of public space. In the downtown area, a large park on the edge of the city appears more like an afterthought waiting to be realized. This is a chunk of the landfill that was added by Solidaire in order to increase the value of property and of the company. Judging by the progress of the developments in downtown Beirut, most of the buildings are going up, but most of the public spaces are not there yet. Those that are look like gigantic planters. This was not the intention behind the much celebrated and contested master plan, but somehow it slipped back into conventional practices. No doubt, public space requires heavy investment on the part of the public sector. In Lebanon, this sector may be highly bureaucratized and sophisticated in its procedures, but financially it is rather poor. In contrast, Solidaire, which is a private real estate holding company, is excessively rich. So in this case, we may need another explanation for the weakening of the public dimensions of the master plan. I want to suggest that it could be found in the transition between the first proposed plan for the city center and the second, and between what we in urban design terms call articulation and regulation. And that slippage from articulation and regulation is actually a practice that happens constantly in Lebanon, with war or without, in the Christian areas or in the Muslim. The story of the shift between the two master plans is an interesting one. Immediately after the war, Hariri and Dar al-Handasa, the guys who are building those skyscrapers around the Haram in Mecca, unveiled this master plan for downtown Beirut. It was a highly articulated master plan, particularly in the way that its architecture is defined, particularly in the way that its different neighborhoods are outlined, and in the way that the public spaces are defined. There was a major uproar in Beirut about that, not at all because of the public investment that it will entail, but because of the restrictions that it imposed on potential developers from heights point of view, volumes point of view, but also aesthetically. Conveniently, the government dropped that plan, maintained Dar al-Handasa and changed the architects, and went from a plan that was highly articulated to a plan that, with the exception of some street alignments, some axiality, and some vague sense of how to preserve certain buildings, deferred everything to the regulations that guide the individual buildings. So in many ways, the articulation of the public spaces was deferred to individual architects of the buildings surrounding them and to the implementation of these regulations. Deferring the creation and preservation of the public realm of the city is also happening towards the building code. And in Lebanon, it means that the private sector will take care of defining the public spaces, and that also entails writing a code that would do so, and secondly, implementing the code. If we look even within downtown, where supposedly there's very strong regulation and very strong guidance of the builders according to the building code, we notice, for example, a new project by Jean Nouvel, which has displaced completely a tower that was supposed to be about 200 meters and brought it into the development, amplifying the development and its value at this rather fragile corner in the city, and important one, and dwarfing what was one of the main public spaces to become something like a doormat in front of a new development. This is done according to regulation. And I would like to argue that it is not only in downtown Beirut, but elsewhere, that this process of amplification and shifting is done based on regulation, not outside the rules. So the city looks like this because it does follow a very complicated legal and regulation process. And again, along the lines of the discussions yesterday about what constitutes a state mosque, I want to show you the kind of amplification that happened from 17th century mosque of Mount Lebanon. This was the official mosque, to the present official mosque in downtown Beirut, right next to the Hariri burial grounds. This was supposed to be a reconstruction of a small mosque at the corner, but slowly property was bought and the mosque was amplified according to code. What I would like to argue is that the code not only takes away the condition of articulation from the public dimension, but it also, because of the heightened differentiation that happens within it, it produces a sense of sameness, and a different kind of sameness than one would expect as a level, I would distinguish that from a notion of monotony or homogeneity. Let me describe different conditions that the code produces sameness through. There is a 9-meter drop between the highest point of the site and the lowest point. And in the balloon project, we tried to address this difference by not flattening the terrain, which is a common practice in Lebanon, but by lifting the bottom tip of the site like a mat to become equivalent in height to the highest point, and to tuck the entrance and cafe underneath. The slope is maintained inside the platform and used to magnify the ascent towards the balloon. Now, this slope is prevalent in most of Beirut. The city built between 2 hills, even though it claims to be built on 7 hills, like many other cities. There is a ridge that runs the length of the coastline to the north that is exactly about 9 meters high, which has produced many of the major topographic challenges in the city. And it is prevalent in most of Beirut. The building code of Lebanon, however, does not take topography into account when assessing height, axis, or overall relationship between building and site. The code is written for a flat terrain. This is a way in which the land is sectioned in order that you could fit a building in a very steep slope, and you can carve it out like that and then put the building inside it. It actually encourages flattening the terrain in order to maximize exploitation. It also discourages continuity between building and landscape, between the one building and the next one. This treatment of topography generates many peculiar and highly differentiated conditions down to the smallest detail, as many of you know very well when you're trying to deal with topography. And after Kenneth Frampton's critical regionalism, however, topography has acquired a certain conscious responsibility towards local articulation, perhaps more than any of the other attributes of site. Highlighting topography, the specificity of place against the universality of a horizontal plane of modern architecture, seems to express a critical awareness and resistance to the neutralization of place by globalization. Beirut does not seem to mind this neutralization. It's written it into its code. Even when Rafael Moneo was designing the souks of Beirut to replace the old souks, which are situated on a steep slope, the commercial consultants encouraged the client, Solidaire, to flatten the ground because it was not conducive to shopping. The preservation code of Solidaire and the building code of Lebanon would have allowed that, but the architect convinced the developer that it was more important, both for the project's integrity and for shopping, to maintain the continuity of the flow with the surrounding city than to provide smooth continuity inside the project. And I will come back to this condition of interiority both in architectural and religious terms later. The design of the balloon platform absorbed the slope into a purer geometry of symmetries and overlaps. Even though it was anchored in the specificity of the site, it tried to transcend it without nullifying it. Now, topography is not the only aspect through which differentiation in the city is nullified by code. There is a way in which the code is written so that it doesn't distinguish between park and and building. There is a way in which the code is written in order that it actually disrespects the alignment with the street. So in terms of the relation with the street, it emphasizes the gabarit condition on the rooftop rather than street alignment. And so if you follow this rule, you look at the parcels that exist on the site, many parcels move back in order to gain height from the street and therefore create a very irregular street frontage. There's also another condition that somehow kills frontality or kills the identity of buildings, which has to do with giving 20% extra square footage for building of balconies, and which results in the production of pancake buildings that are literally about the stacking of the horizontal plane again and again. And you can see that in the new skyline of Beirut. You can see not only the sort of conditions of misalignment in order for people to gain height, but you see the condition of staggering and the amplification that goes from the buildings of the 1950s and 60s to the present buildings today. And there's even more taller ones coming behind. Thanks to this code, therefore, the individuality of the building prevails. Buildings are highly differentiated, yet they look like each other. The heightened individuality at the parcel level takes away from the collective characteristic streets and public spaces that we conventionally associate with what makes up a city. This mincing, or the tabbouleh effect, as I call it, of urbanism, if you allow me one self-orientalizing slip, which happens by building code, this differentiation at a very fine grain happens also with mosques and churches. When mosques and churches, which are supposed to be highly articulated, are confronted with other highly articulated objects in the city, they tend to disappear in that confusion. And you can see this kind of relationship between the bay windows here and the minaret. You can see the way that the balconies of the mosque begin to resemble the balconies of a residential building, and even sometimes they acquire shops and residences within them as well. Increasingly, we are seeking a heightened articulation of form against a sameness that speculation encourages. Are we then afraid of sameness in the urban condition? Could the sameness that happens in Beirut be another lesson for urban planning? Deferring the urban decision to the individual architectural act has ultimately trivialized it, but it has also rendered it reversible, changeable, and deliberated with every architectural intervention. If this act of heightening small differences, the narcissism of small differences, has generated a sense of sameness within the city, it has nevertheless generated a particular pulse to the city, a pulse that Beirut also shares with other cities along the Mediterranean like Athens, Izmir, Alexandria, and to which I will return at the end. Beirut, however, is not content with this condition of sameness, and it has found a shortcut, or at least I want to describe one of the shortcuts out of this dilemma. This is the kind of urbanism that I'm describing. Initially, the balloon was intended to be a stark yellow ball, but when the client made his budget calculations, he realized that the euro cost of the balloon and its operations could not be compensated by a reasonable ticket price for the balloon ride in Lebanese pounds. A sponsor was found, and in Lebanon it is typically banks that sponsor, given the solidity of the banking sector and the excess of savings that have risen exponentially since the recession. To be able to fly, the balloon acquired a band that carried the slogan, but not the name of the bank. This was a compromise that we reached to obtain the permit for advertising. Now, another interesting dimension where much of the focus happens around advertising, not architecture regulation. The governor of Beirut, a political appointee who came from the rival political party of Hariri, was the final authority on the advertisement regulation. And since the downtown was Hariri turf, it was also a battleground to show who's in power. While usually politicians do not get into this level of ephemeral details, he may have found in permitting the banner on the highly visible balloon a way of exerting some power. The redundancies between the role of governor and mayor is another thing that we need to discuss, and it usually creates, and it is based that the mayor of the city is Sunni Muslim and the governor is Greek Orthodox. And it continues to fuel many of the rivalries in the urban politics of Beirut, including giving a permit for an advertisement on a balloon. The governor's excuse was that there was no law to govern advertising on flying objects. He was appealing to the problems of controlling advertisement all over the city, which had gone out of his hand. When the client politely pointed to the huge banner on the Holiday Inn, the governor said they were breaking the law, but he could not do anything about it. To date, and with the exception of downtown Beirut, there is really very little control on how big and where and how many signs there are in any location in the city of Beirut. A few historic towns has sought to introduce such standards, but their impact has been limited. There is a high demand for advertising, one which has oxymoronically multiplied tenfold since the proliferation of television networks after the war. And Lebanon's graphic design and advertisement industries feed the Arab world with images and seem to use Beirut's consumer culture as their testing ground. This has turned into not only advertisement for commercial purposes, but for political purposes and religious purposes as well. And there's a very effective way of communication in signage and in graphics and in advertisement. This is the Johnny Walker advertisement in Beirut after the Israeli bombing of 2006, when the Israelis strategically hit all the bridges in the city. This proliferation of signage has turned every available surface into a potential display surface. Coupled with the anonymity and similarity among buildings, advertising has indeed become the way to distinguish between buildings. Postmodernism, Anthony Appiah has told us, has turned everything to a sign, and every sign reads, "For sale." Churches and mosques are not foreign to these practices, and indeed we can talk about the iconostasis and the practices of producing icons and displaying them in a very similar tradition, I would say. Less commercial perhaps, but similar. But we can see also, and despite the scale of these new buildings, and despite their orientation towards an interior, still an attempt to use, this is the papal flag on a Christian church, on a Catholic church in downtown Beirut, the graphic as a form of, I would say, not even complementing, but superseding the architectural, showing that perhaps the architectural is insufficient to carrying over a message to the public. So despite the heavy iconographic references to Sunni traditions, it required putting the picture of the Sunni Saudi king in front of the mosque to show the general public that this belongs to that, and quickly after that for the Shiites to bring in the pictures of Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah to reclaim the iconography of that place, or to reclaim the place through iconography. Architects have not been neutral to this phenomenon. Actually, they have turned, some of them have turned their buildings into billboards of sorts, and others have appropriated elements of the media technology into their architecture. In the design of the surfaces of the balloon, we used writing on the surface of the building and on the ground to communicate, drawing signage on and out of the surface, and speaking perhaps to some of the central debates about surface architecture today, but also to the graphic condition of architecture in Beirut. Increasingly, and against the postmodern tendencies of elevating the local to a finality, architects have been leaping over the immediacy of their contexts to speak to the world, through the mediation of their discipline and through other means like the graphic. The discipline of architecture still holds on to differentiation as an inherent good, and from these experiences in Beirut, we have to probably begin to question that value, or that set of values. Herein lies another rich tension in Beirut, that Beirut has resolved a bit too quickly by burying its head into the ground, by going inside, as it were. International style reporters, and they are one of the biggest tourist components in Beirut these days, record the wealth and exuberance and differentiation of Beirut's interiors as perhaps a way that the city is able to articulate difference most clearly, but interestingly, when you go inside, the city tends to replicate the world. This is where the city's cosmopolitanism finds its most articulate and edifying presence, even though the construction of such interiors, which are sometimes exteriors, depends on very vast social differences between workers, laborers, and the people who support these interiors, and the people who consume those spaces. And this condition of spectacular total interiority enters into the spaces of religion par excellence. This is a Christian cathedral. This is one of the old mosques recently cleared in order to exaggerate its interiority conditioned by the kind of grotto effect of the ceilings that seems to become a fad in most religious buildings today. And again, back to the mosque where this interior is a kind of transposition or transportation of the visitor, not to some celestial place, but to Istanbul, to the kind of clear worldly reference that the architecture wants to replicate. Yet speaking to the world from inside these imagined worlds could ultimately generate models, ways of projecting how things could be otherwise, if we could only calibrate how these interiors can leak in Beirut and otherwise to the outside world. Let me conclude. Many unusual qualities have come out of my reading of the factors that shape the urban spaces. Vitality of voids, heightened differentiation that produces evenness, a treatment of space as surface, emptiness of the public space, if not its absence, and the interiority, the graphic interiority of the city's urbanism. At one level, we can dismiss these qualities as utterly undesirable. At another, they can be read as a reflection of the mercantilist ethos of the Levant, and Beirut is the epitome of that, where religious plurality, if anything, encourages commercial exchange and therefore is welcome. But one that has shaped its behavior in the longue durée, as it were, and that must have shaped its cities along the way accordingly. Is this then a long duration of constant change? It may be coincidental that Fernand Braudel developed his theory of the longue durée around the study of the Mediterranean, but the image of the Mediterranean city does resonate here. An overture towards the sea, an indifference to the countryside, a fine grain of mixture, rich private, poor public sectors. Some qualities of the Mediterranean do not hold, specifically Braudel's idea of a synchronically unfolding history. History here keeps getting cleared. Or secondly, the model of the small, independent, religious and ethnic communities that cling to the countryside and that defy the self-containment of the city by that geographic link. This may be the case politically, but the shape of the city really does not display that connection to the countryside. The general feel, many of the style counselors, and there are many of them, would confirm, is Mediterranean. You read wallpaper, it says that. It may be difficult to deny the strong presence of the big blue, such as in this image, but the question begs itself. Have I, after all of this, simply performed a leap from one set of stereotypes about Beirut as a Middle Eastern city to another about Beirut as a Mediterranean city? I evoke Michael Hertzfeld, the anthropologist's warning that stereotypes, and he is speaking about the Mediterranean stereotype, may be completely false, but they have to be taken seriously because the people they are applied to believe in them. Perhaps in the end, I am simply a self-perpetuating Mediterranean stereotype, one that believes in the yearning of distant shores of Cafavi and Pagnol, and in the beautiful summer that is not afraid of fall. This was a song by Georges Moustaki. But thankfully, there are many other Mediterraneans, less nostalgic. The Mediterranean that is most compelling and pertinent to this argument is that of historian David Abulafia, who speaks of distant shores with a frequency of communication between them. What is most pertinent in this proposal is that the Mediterranean becomes a model that could be applied to the world. The increasing sameness within Beirut and between Beirut and the rest of the world no doubt points to the dissolution of place, and to the acceleration of development to the point where we can now anticipate a world moving in real estate development sync, both secular and religious, both in Beirut and outside, especially after the recession and the global risks that it generated. These risks do include security and economic vulnerability that tie Beirut's patterns to those of the world and bring it sometimes to the point of brinkmanship and collapse. Perhaps, as some argue, in order to speak to the world. We need to make noise as a small country in order to make the world hear us. We ought to think again about whether the sameness in the world is a sign of poverty, of form, or of an untapped richness, a new source of inspiration for architecture. This sameness I'm anticipating is hopefully not dull. It points to the fact that we are all worldly. This is the worldliness of Edward Said, but also of the Greek-French philosopher Kostas Axelos, that we work to link to the world from where we are, to achieve a sense of the totality, and this is again very different from totalization, and to anticipate a city world before and beyond globalization, before and after secularism, that flows with Heraclitus's river, where identities could be constantly constructed, and constructed in part by design. Thank you.
So we're going to have a 10-minute break, and then Makram El-Kadi will respond to these two very erudite papers. So 10 minutes. So welcome back. My colleague, Makram El-Kadi, who's been very helpful to me in organizing this event, is going to now respond to the two papers of Peter Eisenman and Hashim Sarkis. And then we'll have our speakers come to the front of the room, and there will be a brief period of questions and conversation about what they have presented. Then, unfortunately, Razem Badran is not with us today because of visa difficulties, but we will move immediately into Rafi Siegel's talk, and then that will be followed by Lamin Sane's comments. So that gives you an idea of what's coming up before lunch. So I'll turn it over to Makram.
Thank you. All right. Can you turn off the lights, please? I want to start my response with a clarification about the actual term Middle East that is in the title of the symposium. And it's a clarification that would, in the process, shed some light on how religious communities in the Middle East perceive of themselves. To talk about a Middle East implies an implicit Eurocentrism to the term, as opposed to the term Western Asia, for example, officially designated by the United Nations, or the term Levant or Mashriq, an East that is opposed to the Maghreb West. Hence, implicit as well should be our need to understand as architects and historians the history of that influence in shaping the contemporary Middle East with all its drawbacks and all its achievements at the political as well as the architectural levels. Any reading outside of this notion runs the risk of giving not necessarily an incomplete reading, as no one reading is, but an inaccurate one. The parcelization of the Middle East from colonial times up to the present wars produced the notion of Qutr in Arabic, which means a renewed emphasis on the notion of a nation state, as opposed to the notion of Ummah that conceived the space of the Middle East as a more contiguous geography. I will not go into the causality of this parcelization, which is more political in nature, but I'm more interested in the implications of this reduced notion of space, the most dangerous of which is an attempt to differentiate and oppose between the different social and religious components in the Middle East. The biggest threat in that area to regional and international stability is in fact not the multitude of religions, but the proliferation of religious ghettos and exclusive enclaves, starting with religious countries down to religious neighborhoods and ultimately religious buildings if they exist. It is hence a spatial problem de facto. The jump I'm going to take with respect to my response to Eisenman's notion of text and narrative is the following. In Wagner's Parsifal specifically. I will try to extend this notion to our contemporary understanding of religion and religious buildings, specifically with respect to Islamic religious buildings or Muslim religious buildings. The apparent dichotomy between Islam and modernity needs a revision. For one, Islam at its onset was the forebearer of many modernist ideas and concepts that preceded and influenced the Enlightenment project. If the product of enlightenment was the separation of church and state, in Islam, this notion is more complex. On the one hand, the notion of state didn't exist at the onset of the religion, and it can be argued that state is more of a Western concept. Was the separation of church and state possible because the Bible was a text? And is it less possible in Islam because the Quran as a revelation is a meta-narrative? At first instance, that seems to be the case. The first verse of the Quran stipulates a reading, read in the name of Allah. The word Quran itself is a derivative of reading. However, Islam, with its genesis as a revelation, a munzal text, is conceived as a narrative that has the seeds of being textual through the notion of ijtihad, which means opinions in jurisprudence as opposed to taqlid or imitation of the text. So these are the two notions, which makes the text overdetermined in the post-structural sense of deference or différence in French. If this is the case and Islam can be perceived as a text, are we heading towards a separation of church and state in Islam as well, or mosque and state in that case? Would a secularization of Islam be achieved by practicing the Quran as a text? This is where the notion of deen, dunya, and dawla becomes very interesting in the sense that its relevancy in breaking the dialectic between Western notions of church and state. To this effect, dunya which is society, as a concept, seems to offer a contiguity between mosque and state that might preclude the need for a separation between both. This notion also shows through this continuity that Islam is inherently political and cannot but be. Its militarization is the problematic exaggeration of its political condition and not its political predisposition. As architects, we can stipulate on possible architectural implication of the physical space of the mosque in relationship to the social space of Islam, with this notion of continuity between state, society, and mosque. Historically, the mosque offered programmatic hybridity beyond its religious functions, be it schools or hammam or other libraries or whatnot, in comparison to the church that sat secluded in its own public square. It is potentially through this expanded notion of the program, going beyond the liturgical, that architects can reflect on the notion of interplay between deen, dunya, and dawla, to find the space of negotiation, of equilibrium, and of critique. Going to the case of Beirut, and this is a notion of geographies of fear that I'm taking from Samir Khalaf, the sociologist. Beirut's city center claims the highest density of religious buildings per meter square in the world, with dozens of churches and mosques and one synagogue recently renovated. Dictated not by a demographic demand for more religious buildings, this density is a symbolic and a territorial turf war to mark each religion's political presence. One can only read the recently completed Al-Amin Mosque of 2005 as a response, almost 30 years after, to the Lady of Lebanon Basilica in Harissa, which Hashim showed recently. This is the exterior and the interior. This church, and to reinforce Peter's and Hashim's arguments of no architectural specificity to religion, was inspired both by Kanzo Tange's St. Mary's Cathedral in Tokyo and also its Olympic Stadium, which befits the fact that religion in Lebanon is a national sport. The Al-Amin Mosque marked urbanistically, albeit not architecturally, the paradigm shift in Lebanese politics from a Christian-dominated political system to one that is still sectarian and confessional in essence, yet predominantly Muslim. This is the percentages of the demographics. In 2010, as yet another response, the biggest illuminated cross in the world was erected in Qanat Bakish in Lebanon. They first claimed that it was the biggest cross in the world, which turned out not to be the case because it exists somewhere in Latin America, I think. So then they switched it to the biggest illuminated cross in the world. If religious identity is not shaped by architecture, as Hashim posits, it is certainly shaping our architecture. If we can learn anything from this back and forth, is at least a certain faith that architecture is still relevant in the public and political realm. It is at this exact juncture that architects need to step up into a more proactive role and search for ways to mitigate fake dialects and oppositions between the different religions by offering a third direction, one that does not necessarily antagonize, but that critically opens the debate about the issues at play. It may seem that religious architecture as such can't necessarily mediate between the different religious compositions, unless we are dealing, for example, with a multi-denominational / politically correct architectural structure. Whether a church, mosque, or synagogue, the role of religious architecture can be at the least that of an open expression versus a threatening monolithic one that suggests antagonism towards the other. This is at the symbolic level, I admit. At the other, more operational level, religious buildings do maintain a rejectionist agenda in their exclusive programmatic and liturgical use by people of their own faith. As members of any other religion, we don't visit mosques, churches, and synagogues outside of their liturgical function, except when we are tourists with an external gaze. In the case of the mosque, the hybrid nature of its program, as I mentioned before, which is a hybridity avant la lettre that preceded that in contemporary architectural discourse, can potentially expand this role of social and cultural glue that would link the different components of society together beyond a specific religious background and beyond a touristic attraction, hence becoming an this overdetermined text that I was talking about. This approach would take us back to the notion of the mosque. Would take back the notion of the mosque to its original definition, its two translations in Arabic as either a jami', which means a place of gathering, or a masjid, which is a place of prostration. It is this programmatic and architectural loophole within the program of the mosque itself, similar to the notion of ijtihad in religion or in theology mentioned previously, that has the ability to link the mosque to modernity, not just stylistically, but operationally. This is our interest in the studio we are now conducting at Yale entitled The Expanded Mosque, where we are looking at this expanded definition of the mosque into the social life of the city. We can find also other attempts at an architecture that goes beyond its secular role into a positive secularism, so to speak. I will highlight a couple of examples, like the currently under construction project by Giancarlo Di Carlo in Beirut, that tries through aesthetics to find a common denominator that precedes contemporary conflicts between the different religious groups of the city. This has, of course, its problematic aspects, as it does not address the conflicting issues at hand head on, but tries to go back to a time where these issues didn't exist, and does so stylistically. This is the other slide for this project. Another example acknowledges the difference between the religions and places it at the forefront in a non-confrontational fashion. In this case, Catherine Gustafson's Garden of Forgiveness assumes reconciliation by mere physical proximity and showcases of multiplicity of vegetations from the different religious geographies of the country. In both cases, architects and landscape architects are asking the pertinent questions, even if they fail to give us the correct answers to them. Referring to what Hashim describes as the delusion of an architectural answer to the wars of identity, perhaps the most successful and promising attempt is culinary in nature, a small restaurant that invites weekly cooks from different and several geographic and religious backgrounds to elaborate in negotiations with each other new menus of food that are as such trans-religious in nature. Can architecture come up with its own post-religious menu? One answer in Lebanon might be social housing, which would possibly shift the discussion from a make-believe religious struggle to what it really should be, i.e. a class warfare. I once asked Peter, with the near collapse of the financial market in 2009 and the advance of a more social agenda in the United States, whether architecture can still be active in its critical resistance to the capitalist project, or should the focus shift? History did not end like Fukuyama wanted us to believe. We ask ourselves, what role in the age of renewed religious interest can architecture play? Can we think of a secular architecture as opposed to a non-religious one? One that is proactively secular? Arkoun argued against Huntington's clash of civilization and described it as a mere clash of the imaginaries. It is within this context that I'm reminded here by another quote of Arkoun, which I would like to end my response with. The contention is that architects, more efficiently than intellectuals and scholars, can resist the devastating violence generated by the confrontation of religion, state, and society, deen, dunya, and dawla, the three major concepts developed in classical Arabic thought, at a greater scale than all societies and cultures in history have achieved thus far. This means that all important architectural achievements contribute either to strengthening the dominant ideology in any given historical tradition and political order, or to creating a breakthrough in the inherited, imposed system of values and beliefs. Thank you. Maybe Peter and... So maybe, Peter, we can start by discussing this notion of the sacred and the religious, I mean, specifically in the memorial, but also this idea of a new resistance project somehow to architecture.
A resistance to architecture?
For architecture, sorry, a new role of resistance.
Well, first of all, to answer the question that you raised earlier, I think architecture is always already political. So we don't have to worry about that. But for example, just because it's political, architecture did not necessarily contribute to the fall of the USSR, the communist hegemony, let's say. And I don't believe that architecture is making any contribution to the, let's say, problematic state of Western capital, right? It doesn't need to abet the changes that are going to occur. So I don't think that's what we're talking about, it being already political. I think architecture has the inherent capacity to, through its iconicity, to produce cultural values in the society. And I think what Hakeem showed was how over time these icons change and transform conceptions of social space, political space. For example, the memorial in Berlin, if you want to take that as an example, it started out as a very controversial project because the Jewish community thought it would create anti-Semitism. The right-wing community thought this was a wrong thing to have in the heart of what was the Nazi hegemony in Berlin. So it was, at the beginning, a problematic project. It took 10 years. It was on, off, on, off. Ultimately, it was decided by a political system, as most projects are. But if you look at the memorial today, it's had over 5 million visitors, about 1 million visitors a year in the 5 years of its existence. And most of those visitors have no idea what it is. In other words, the school children that run, they play tag like school children running around a Catholic church. They have no idea that it's a sacred space. There are Israelis that come and lay stones or leaves or things as a symbolic resonance. There are also people of various communities that use the place to make love, for assignations, for naked sunbathing. The stones are perfect for that. They're great for skateboarding. I mean, everything but necessarily a sacred space. And I do not think it was intended as a sacred space, but as a different urban experience. In other words, a kind of out-of-mind, out-of-body experience, which would be different than the Reichstag, the Brandenburg Gate, anything that you would call urban, to remind one of this problematic moment of difference that the Nazi period, that period of 12 years was in German history. In other words, it's an aberration in the urban fabric as Nazism was an aberration in German historical fabric. I think that's all you can say about it. Is it sacred? I don't think so. Is it a very important secular and political gesture by the government? Absolutely. So in that sense, the government used a political problematic and to produce something that was seen as a not a, as Habermas said, I mean, Agamben said, it was neither an archival memory, it was neither a religious memory, it was something ineffable that had to be produced. So that's all I can say about it. I mean, it's, but I wanted to say one other thing about your correspondence of the Quran with the problematic in Christianity. If you read Jean-Luc Nancy's book, which is, I think, fascinating, on disenclosure, he talks about the difference between the letters of Paul and the letters of James, and talks about that split that early on defined what the Catholic Church was to become, and that had the Jamesian letters become the dominant discourse as opposed to the Pauline letters, we would have had a different form of Christianity, let's say. And of course, this is where those people that are looking to open Christianity to question, to open it to its contemporary situation, would suggest going back and looking at James and the Jamesian letters as a way of thinking Christianity again today, and which is similar to what you're talking about in looking at the openings in the Quran. I think they're the same openings in the notion of Christianity.
Hashim, I mean, can we consider, if we do consider, let's say, the memorial in Berlin as this new public space that is trans-religious in nature, would the same, or what would be the public space of Beirut, for example, that would deal with these issues? I mean, you mentioned the street, and you always talk about the street as the only public space of Beirut somehow. Does public space in Lebanon have the possibility of being ecumenical in nature?
Let me respond obliquely by pulling out the ecumenos from what you're saying, because it's interestingly equivalent, it's to be distinguished from the cosmos, and it is also interestingly equivalent in some capacity to the notion of ummah, or in another dimension, what you mentioned about the dunya. And this is where I think we can enter into a discussion about religion as maybe not an opposition, not to create an opposition between the religious and the secular, but to introduce the notion of the ecumenos or the ummah as being that mediates. And within that, I think, as you mentioned, architecture could play a very important deliberative role. In terms of specific spaces in Beirut, I did distinguish between the interiority of much of what I would consider public space in Beirut as opposed to other places, and the possibility that the interiors themselves can spill out is something that I've been thinking about as a potential for rethinking the relationship or the role of public space in a place like Lebanon. What does that mean? I don't know, because interiors tend to be much more exclusive, tend to be much more territorialized. And the exteriors in Lebanon specifically are not very edifying or edified. They tend to be neglected. And therefore the claim of the exterior as being a representative public space is less important than the claim of the interior, which is why I'm still thinking about that question, and why even if we think of Martyrs Square as being that territory that everybody claims, there is still a very loose relationship between citizens and the public spaces that they occupy. The street is definitely the public space, primarily because it is distributed everywhere, and therefore its proximity to the interior is stronger than the proximity of a major public square like Martyrs Square or the Garden of Forgiveness.
But let me ask you a question that's always interested me, Hashim, is that if we look from the West, or a particular viewpoint of the West here, at the energy of fundamentalism, it doesn't seem to have as a goal any territorial gain. In other words, it doesn't appear to be territorial in its objective, that is, place bound. It's in fact seems to be unconcerned with place. In other words, they don't want to take over the United States or the Soviet Union or the former or China, etc. They seem to exist in the interstitial spaces like Yemen, Afghanistan, the border regions of Pakistan, where this fundamentalism seems to take root, not for the gain of place, but for in a sense, almost the denial of the need for place. How would you argue that?
I don't know, it's an interesting observation, but I mean, it is definitely a condition or a quality that we can associate with many resistance movements, that they tend to move out, withdraw before then they come back. It's, again, the condition that Gramsci has talked about as the enclave condition. So in that sense...
So in that sense, it's very similar to any...
I think so. I think so. Again, I hope I'm not overdoing it by trying not to essentialize the Middle East and by trying not to make something very particular about the fundamentalism, but to historicize it and compare it, put it in a comparative perspective.
No, but I thought you were saying that Beirut occupies today a modality of the possibility of a generic condition of presence today.
Yes.
Well, couldn't you say the same thing about fundamentalism then?
No.
No.
No, I would not. I would not.
Okay.
I would still associate it with forms of resistance that ultimately will acquire territorial presence.
Okay.
Questions? Kishwar? It's more like microfinancing.
Yeah.
Than human.
Thanks. I wanted to ask about the relationship between the concepts of appropriation, critique, and this curious term redemption. As Vasilios Marinas pointed out in his introduction to this session, a lot of the sites that we're talking about in this symposium and a lot of the building typologies are ones which were originated by one group of people according to one set of beliefs or practices, and then were taken over by somebody else or appropriated. And so I'm grateful to Peter Eisenman for raising the question of this concept of redemption as a form of transformation or appropriation. Redemption, it's a very Wagnerian term. It's obviously central to Parsifal, and it also has obvious religious overtones. And so my question is an appropriation that departs as radically from the original intentions as this Bayreuth production of Parsifal departs from Wagner's original intentions for the story. Is it fair to call that a redemption of Wagner? And if you do that, are you in a sense vindicating Wagner's idea of redemption? Or would you say that it's, rather than redemption, it's a kind of critique, a secular critique, or something that's different from the Wagnerian concept?
Well, to answer you as quickly, it is a difficult answer. You could argue that the performance of Parsifal today is an act of redemption of the German state, of National Socialism. You could enter that, because to dispel National Socialist energies, they've had to dispel with Christianity and all of the symbols which were part of, even though Parsifal and let's say the Ring to a large extent was Nordic in its Teutonic idea of Germanness, the Nazis certainly weren't about being Christian in that sense. But I argued in another paper that I wrote for Die Zeit, the last line was that, in fact, this kind of production also redeemed Wagner's own anti-Semitic and problematic relationship with German culture and what he perceived to be the problematics of the characters in, for example, The Ring. All of his negative characters are stereotypes of Jewish functioning. If we are to understand Hagen, if we understand Alberich, if we're understanding Kundry, all of them would have been understood in the 1880s, 90s, etc., as for what they were. So what I would argue is, since we no longer see those as stereotypes, the syphilitic, masturbating Hagen, we don't understand them that way at all, that maybe, in fact, Wagner has been redeemed through this transformation.
Through critique?
Yes.
There is a similar form of redemption that takes place in Lebanon in a much more literal way. That has to do with the way that the warlords were systematically the first people to identify archaeology as a potential domain of redemption. That the first collectors of archaeology after the war were the warlords, the previous warlords, and transformed many of their palaces into reliquaries, first of pieces that came out of the war, but then became pieces that they collected out of archaeological connections before it became illegal to do so. And much of that kind of nostalgia, I can call it, and the continuity between the act of destruction and the act of collection is something that we probably need to look at a bit more in Lebanon and identify whether there are, let's say, archaeological preferences among the different warlords and why.
Could I ask you one question just that you brought up? I hadn't realized that Bayreuth was Beirut. By the way, what is the connection, the epistemological connection? What does Beirut mean? And what is
It's
Beirut in
Kanani.
Francais?
It's probably the fact that they added an H.
Yes.
The French may have something to do with the contamination.
To Bayreuth.
Yeah.
Yes, but what does it mean?
Beirut means many wells.
Many wells?
Many wells in Kanani.
Okay.
In an old Semitic language.
But the real question is, why did it go to Bayreuth in Germany? That's
just a false friend.
Yeah.
you do think you think there's nothing to do with each other. Although
The possibility that they might,
Hashim braised it, by the way.
is just as a joke.
Oh, okay. But our jokes, we have to, you know,
One more question.
Vincent
Oh,
auf
if you have
Deutsches.
time. My question was, well, first of all, to thank Peter, I think, for bringing putting on the forefront the question of whether we really are talking about religion at all. And as you pointedly brought out, that it's about race as well, and ethnicity and language and so on and so forth, and that perhaps we should introduce that into our conversation today, too. But more importantly, the idea that architecture is one of possibilities of bringing redemption, but also reification, not necessarily of belief, but of life. And I think, Hashim, your project with the balloon platform showed that, and that this quest that Makram brings up for creating a public space for healing or for reconciliation or ecumenical, perhaps. My question to the panel is, why then do we leave out religion at all? So when you showed the religious buildings, we didn't really enter into them other than as parodies or critique. The Al-Amin Mosque that you showed, I had the opportunity to speak with the architect a month ago. And the way that he described his project was that, in fact, the cornices of the mosque have been aligned with the campanile of the St. George Maronite Church right there. His selection of the color of the stone, in fact, has to do with the Lebanese stone, and so on and so forth. So there's a certain detail that the architect is presenting himself as a project of healing. Now, certainly it's a political act, it's monumental, so on and so forth, but how about also allowing for the architect to speak through his own voice for these projects before we critique them so rapidly?
I think it's a very interesting question, and my answer would also come from something that Makram said. I believe that the paradigm shift has nothing to do, as I said, between architecture, but the opening of religion to questioning under contemporary secular energies. And Makram said that the Quran is open to these possibilities. Jean-Luc Nancy and Badiou argue that Christianity is open to these. And maybe the paradigm shift is within religion, not within architecture. And I want to say I'd rather move the discussion to the religious side rather than and talking about this concept of the other, whether it's a Freudian shadow, the id, or whatever. The other of the sacred is the secular and vice versa. So they're totally entwined with one another in the psychoanalytic approach to these things. So I would argue that the real thing that I discovered in my work on this paper was that their current philosophy, particularly people like Zizek, Jean-Luc Nancy, Badiou, etc., who are in the forefront of thinking today, are dealing with these religious subjects and not even thinking about them in relation to their architecture.
My response would be that my focus in terms of looking at these religious buildings was how I could fold them into the larger practices that shape the city. So in particular case of the Al Amin Mosque, it is a parody because of the amplification that it acquires in relation to everything else. But I am interested in the church, perhaps more than religion in this particular context, because the church is a client, it's a patron, it builds, it's a landowner, it sometimes has its own contracting companies. I mean, in Lebanon, the church is very active in the building industry. You remember the Vatican built Watergate, right? Mm-hmm. It's very much equalized with the other developers and the other citizens in terms of its practices and the kinds of exceptions that it seeks in its practices as well. So that's what I was trying to present, the religious practices, in order to, after the equalization, to try to get out of Beirut a sense of worldliness, as I described, that could replace this dichotomy between religious pluralism or religious essentialization and secularism, and show that we could operate within that platform, and it's a platform that could be productive. So the parody was much more about the amplification within that mosque, and that amplification is in itself a practice that goes on in real estate terms everywhere else.
Okay.
All right, our third speaker today is Rafi Sigal. Sigal's practice and research engages architecture in its broader urban, cultural, and socio-political context. Among his previous design works is the Palmach History Museum, designed together with V. Hecker and built in Tel Aviv. And current work includes a peace museum war archive in Uganda and a hillside housing project in Greece. Sigal's research projects and publications include Cities of Dispersal, Territories, Islands, Camps, and Other States of Utopia, and A Civilian Occupation, The Politics of Israeli Architecture. He is currently adapting his PhD dissertation from Princeton to a first-time publication on the exceptional work of Alfred Neumann in the 1960s Israel. Sigal teaches architecture, urban design, and planning at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. And the title of his talk today is From Building to Outpost, Religious Sites of Israeli Architecture.
Thank you. Thank you, Carla, and everyone, the organizers, for having me. When I looked at the program and the really fantastic collection of speakers, I found myself, if by choice or not, taking on the Israeli factor here, which I will address through a series of episodes that deal with the role and the architecture of what we can call maybe the religious site. Can we get the lights, please? Makom is the Hebrew word for place, but it is also a synonym for God. Judaism's prohibition to speak the name of God, as is written in the Bible, has promoted the use of other names for God. Hamakom, or the place, suggests that God's existence is embedded in the concept of place. God can be anywhere and everywhere considered a place, and as such could never be physically contained, since place does not exist within another, but rather allows others to exist within it. The stories of the Bible tell us that God resides in a cloud. A one-time historical event brings this holy cloud to settle on the top of Mount Sinai. But for the remainder of the 40 years of wandering in the desert, when there is no mountain in sight, God asks the Hebrews for a tent, a temporal and mobile structure, a kit of parts, easily assembled and dismantled while the nomad tribes move camps in the desert. The first house of God was a tent in the desert, a prefabricated structure called the Mishkan, which means in Hebrew the place of dwelling. Full instructions for the construction of this structure appears in the book of Exodus, chapter 25, verse 10, till chapter 27, verse 19. The whole text fully detailing the plan, the design of the tent's layout, its dimensions, size, proportion, orientation, sighting, furniture, finishes, and even light fixtures, in architecture entirely described in words. We are told that the design of this structure and its interior fittings were shown to Moses while he visited Mount Sinai. Rabbinic interpretation explained Moses' lengthy time on the mountain as required for the study and drafting of the designs. The Bible even says that Moses worked through the nights without sleep, which is perfect for sort of the profile of a young architect. Yeah. The dimensions and proportions of this design, and this is all extrapolated from the text. I didn't do it, others did it for centuries. There's different variations on this. All of these proportions were based on the symmetry and numbers contained within the human body. 2, 5, 10, a proportion system that could easily be registered since it related to different relations in body parts and could be memorized through the body. 5 fingers, 2 fingers, 2 hands is 10, etc., etc. Some argue that it also has something to do with the golden section, etc., but that's not well proven. This tent had a twofold function. One was primarily to house the ark, which contained the convent tablets, a text carved in stone, and the other was to orient and spatially arrange the layout of the tribes as they camped. The Mishkan, which is always referred to as by this structure, spatial implications were perhaps more interesting than its architectural qualities. For the apparently lost Hebrew tribes wandering in the desert, in the expansive, disoriented space of an endless horizon, extending in all directions, the Mishkan was centrally located, rectilinear, in a way that dictated the organization of the whole camp by determining the placement of the 12 tribes in relation to its 4 sides. And here I highlighted the names of the tribes, and you can see the placement of the Mishkan in the center and how the tribes orient themselves. And this becomes a model for the occupation of the tribes in Canaan, and it's seen in all the sort of maps that describe that. It physically divided and marked the territory intended for each tribe, while also acting as a symbol of unification for the tribes. It created a hierarchy and established relations among the tribes and between the tribes and itself. Within the wilderness of the Sinai Desert, the Mishkan had another important role. According to its specific construction guidelines, the plan of the Mishkan had to be aligned with the 4 cardinal directions. Its assembly therefore required revealing the directions axis of the skies, which ancient civilization believed to structure the universe. How would these nomad tribes then know the cardinal directions of the skies? Or how would they reveal the north? Yeah? Which is an interesting question in itself. The practice of reassembling and aligning the structure at any given location within the desert reflected the maintenance of knowledge, the ability to read the starlit skies and uncover an order in space, which was directly tied to the observation and measure of time. And this again has to do with ancient cultures and the ability to read the sky And we know that in Judaism, the calendar is a lunar one, so it's tied into this whole register of time and orientation in space. Judaism emerges as a mobile religion, not yet tied to a particular site or place, but requiring the ark and the tent. The practice of religion begins in the assembling of this Mishkan, a means to assure the knowledge of tracking time, and a spatial organizer of a community, a people made of a collection of separate tribes brought together around it. The sacredness of the structure is created by the presence of the tablets, which is within the Holy of Holies. There are the tablets, which is basically a text. The tablets of the convent, the commandment, the laws, a contract between God and the people. The religious site is the text. What will become the Torah, referred to later as a book of books. Aside the site of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, for 2,000 years and ever since, the religious site in Judaism is primarily a space designated or appropriated to house the book, the Torah, and allow communal prayers and gathering within it. A space becomes sacred as the book enters into it, and the entry of the book into that space represents the existence of a community. The Hebrew word kanes in Hebrew, it's Saturday, so I can allow myself a lesson in Hebrew. Kanes, Hebrew is a root language. Every word has a three-letter root which constructs other words. Kanes is the word to enter together. It is also a name for a conference. Kanes with a kind of an addition to that root means church. Bet Knesset, which uses the same root, bet means house, Knesset means synagogue, and Ha, which is the Knesset again, means is the name for the Israeli parliament. The practice of prayer in the synagogue and the reading of the Torah in public requires the participation of 10 adult Jewish men above the age of 13, what is referred to as a minyan. Thus, Judaism provides a minimum number, 10 male adults and consequently 10 families, which constitute a congregation, a minimum unit of assembly to conduct a community for a dispersed people. Building. Conceptually, the synagogue has changed very little over the past 2,000 years. Throughout history, it appears as a building which has fitted for and reflected the community it served, flexible in size, location, and architectural style. Throughout the diaspora, the synagogue was appropriated to assimilate within the architecture of its surrounding. Architecturally, it echoed the style of its host city, town, or village. Aside a few Jewish symbols here and there, the synagogue did not have any unique architectural characteristics of its own. It adopted a diversity of forms as it attempted to blend in and live within another culture as reflected in the history of the Jewish people. And you can see several from Ethiopia, Shanghai, Budapest. This is a synagogue, not that, yeah. Italy, etc. So, examples are endless. There were cases where the synagogue did stand out, and the degree to which the synagogue could be distinguished from its surroundings reflected the prosperity and the socio-economic and political status of the Jewish community which it housed. The history of the relations between the Jews and the nations of the world which they lived in can be read therefore through the architecture of the synagogue, which was to change dramatically with the establishment of the Israeli state. And there are times where you find the synagogue in a room in an apartment. There are so many examples of its kind of disconnect from any desire to have a specific architectural expression. The establishment of Israel in 1948 offered a new era in freedom of expression for the modern synagogue. As relations between religion and the state were established, and religious law entered civic life and state institutions, whether education, welfare, marriage, army, etc., the pivotal role of the synagogue in the maintenance of religion becomes less relevant since religious law was practiced, even though in part, through the state institutions. And here, this is a very, very delicate and maybe problematic issue on the relation between the Israeli state and Judaism, which is really inseparable and for a while was not as felt among, let's say, Israelis, because the Israeli state was established by a strong secular socialist group, which as long as it kept power, sort of maintained a kind of secular life. But that is, but Israel is going several transformations, and one of them is sort of that group which established the state and was the main sort of component of the army and all the sort of government offices has been gradually losing power through the years. The synagogue was emptied out of the important communal role it had in the diaspora of preserving the religion, since a lot of that has sort of found its way into state law and into sort of customs, whether it's for several reasons. This is again a larger issue and a more complex one. But many of the law, the Israeli law, is in fact made up of British Mandate law, Ottoman law, and Jewish law, which is kind of combined. And many of the religious laws are finding their way and are practiced every day within the secular Israeli state. The establishment of the Israeli state also removed the limitations and restrictions that the synagogue had in the diaspora of a minority group living within another religion. The synagogue became less about the community and more about the freedom to express itself and the freedom to exercise religion. As a building type, its search for identity became ever more present. And here are a few examples of the sort of 1960s, mainly examples from 1960s synagogue within modern Israeli architecture. Architecturally, particularly throughout the early 60s, the synagogue became a site of experimentation. As a building typology, the synagogue was not confined to follow any fixed pattern, plan, type, or layout. Programmatically, the brief was very simple: to provide a space to congregate, preferably oriented towards Jerusalem, but not a must. Centrally locate the Aron HaKodesh, which is the cabin intended to contain the book, the Torah, a bima, which is where you read the book, and sometimes a separation between female and male, but not necessarily always. The example of the officers' synagogue designed by Alfred Neumann and Tzvi Hecker in 1967 in the Negev desert represents an excellent example of this episode in the exploration of the synagogue. This synagogue was designed as part of the IDF, which is, I will refer to it later, the Israeli Defense Forces or the Israeli Army, the same thing. The Army Base Number 1, which is the officers' training school located in isolation in the southern part of the country in the Negev desert. It's not so far from the Dimona nuclear plant, as was in the news recently. It lacks any urban context and was intended to serve only males, since the officers' camp is a male, was only for male. And this is probably one of the most important. Here is a picture taken secretly. It's confidential. The plans of this camp, of the space. And here a more recent picture. This is the housing of the soldiers, of the to-be officers, and you see the synagogue here at the end. The synagogue was designed based on an approach conceived by Alfred Neumann, which can be termed space packing. Neumann's work in the 1960s understood buildings as a spatial patterns of interlocking polyhedral forms. The overall form of a building, and here I show a few examples, was assembled from the joining or the packing of these individual volumes. These units elements followed size and dimension of Neumann's own proportion theory, which had to do with an interpretation of the metric system and the golden section. And these are a few of the examples of this kind of system which led to the design of this synagogue. And this is an earlier version of it, which uses a single shape, a truncated tetrahedron, which if overlaid on a grid the only resemblance to any kind of symbolism would have been the Star of David, which is created, but in fact is made up of a series of hexagons. And after that design, he went into a polyhedral combination of different shapes in this kind of space packing system, which then led to the design of this building, which is his last design before he died. Here we can see a series of plans that show how throughout the section of the building, the interior space changes, and also creating a space to gather water. And with the interpretation of these different layers, some get open and allow light to introduce. Everything is built of concrete and is also understood as sort of one concrete shell, and allowing the space for the three functions: gathering, Harona Kodesh, and Bima. The unconventional synagogue architecture of this building might seem contrary to what one might expect from a regulated and strict institution such as the army. This creative freedom in architecture expression was not just a consequence of 1960s Israeli openness, or let's say high modernism. That's again before 67. And this kind of interest in exploring this identity of the synagogue. But also it was made possible because of the special relation that the army has, the IDF, with religion. Even though the Israeli army has always been clearly associated more than any other Jewish public institution with the most secular parts of Israeli society, religious law was in fact fully integrated into the army's codes and imposed on all its members. IDF regulations require the preservation of kosher food, which means double kitchens and separate cutlery in every base, which is an enormous expense. Yeah? No activity on Saturday, which also makes the army lose money. And all religious holidays, a praying time for any soldier who would request it. So in fact, all religious law is integrated into the army. In addition, each soldier, to complete the army's basic training and swear oath to the state, is given what is known to be called the IDF Bible. And this is a small, compact, pocket-size, complete and unabridged Bible, Old Testament. And I brought a sample here with me, which you can have a look at. It has the army symbol on it, and it is given to every soldier. Officers get the hardcover. The inner cover page shows the symbol of the army's different divisions, 12 in number, modeled after the 12 tribes. This is the general symbol of the army, and these are its different divisions: Navy, Air Force, Service, etc. Intelligence, medicine. The publisher's preface reads, "To the soldier of the Israeli army, presented here to you the Book of Books, which is the bill and certificate of ownership to our country, the heritage of our forefathers." And the preface concludes, "The soldier of the Israeli army, carrier of the flag of our freedom and security of our nation, safeguard the book of God, study it and obey its laws, so that we would be worthy to receive God's promise that," and here a quote from the Torah, "For the Lord you, God, is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you." Yeah, this is pretty hardcore stuff. I mean, I'm sure that many of the soldiers don't bother reading the preface, but nevertheless, every soldier gets one. The synagogue is no longer the sole carrier of the book. The blue cover IDF Bible, designed to fit into the pockets of the army uniform trousers, allows each soldier to carry the book with him at all times, if he or she desires. Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, what would you take to, I mean, if you have one book to take, what book would you take to the battlefield, right? Even though the IDF incorporated religious law into its codes, it maintained the ability to override it by exercising, more so than any other state or public institution, the concept of pikuach nefesh doche Shabbat. This is a phrase which literally means the guarding of a soul, a human, can prevent the preserving of the Sabbath. To say that matters of state security override the practice of religious law. The IDF, through the Israeli government, the Ministry of Defense, remains that organization which makes the call as to what can be considered pikuach nefesh, meaning matters concerning human life. Through this single concept, pikuach nefesh doche Shabbat, the conflict between religion and the state is suspended. The religious and secular sectors of Israeli society find the strongest common ground in the commitment to national security. Outpost. The 1967 Six-Day War between Israel and the Arab nations, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, marked a transformation in Israeli society. Following the war, Israel tripled its territories, and the conquering of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Old City led the nation into an euphoria of victory and spiritual uplifting. The first images of the victory and the liberation, or what was called, of Jerusalem, of what was believed and is always believed to be Judaism's single holiest site, specifically the Temple Mount, and in Hebrew the Temple Mount is called the Mountain of the Home, so it's a much more charged name. The first images that were promoted by the government were photos of soldiers aside the Wailing Wall here. It's a very iconic sort of image of the 1967 war. And army generals walking into the Old City. Moshe Dayan, which was a minister of defense, and Yitzhak Rabin, which was head of the army, and Uzi Narkis, which was head of the central division. And you notice there are no weapons in all of the images that the government released of the occupation and the victory. The soldiers don't have any weapons. It's more than a military conquest. It's a spiritual sort of conquest. It's a national sort of conquest. After the 1967 war, with the Israeli occupation of Jerusalem and the West Bank territories, begins a process of sacredizing the areas around Jerusalem. This process was undertaken in many ways. At first, with the expansion of the holy image of Jerusalem. Israel's adaptation of the British Mandate Jerusalem Stone bylaw, initiated by Sir Roland Storrs, the military governor of Jerusalem between 1917 and 1920, which required the cladding of all new buildings with Jerusalem stone. This law, which has been in place since the early 20th century, facilitated this process of sacredizing the image of Jerusalem. As my colleague Eyal Weizman describes, and I quote, "Shortly after the occupation of the eastern Arab part of the city during the Six-Day War of '67, the municipal boundaries of Israeli Jerusalem were expanded to include the Palestinian population eastern parts, as well as large empty areas around. These new territories, annexed to the city, designated as reserves for future Israeli expansion, were required to comply with Storrs' bylaw. Their buildings to be clad in stone, preserving the traditional and familiar Jerusalem look, turning suburban neighborhoods placed on remote and insignificant sites from the historic center into Jerusalem, and thus participating in the city's sacredness." The stone, and here are some of the early 1970 examples of this, and it's not just a question of the stone. I mean, Mendelssohn built in Jerusalem with stone, others before, but it's also this kind of adaptation of the language of the old city, of the arches, of this kind of what we term as kind of the emergence of the Israeli postmodern phase, which was really centered around Jerusalem, and it continued later to be an expansion of this idea of Jerusalem. The stone visually defines the politically constructed geographic limits of Jerusalem, and since Jerusalem is a holy city, it marks the extent of its holiness. With the empowerment of the Israeli right wing in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Jewish settlements in the occupied territories became a major national project and extended further into all areas of the West Bank. This national project served strategic objectives of the state, and there's a lot to talk about and describe, but also answered a religious aspiration, a return to a biblical setting, the land of the forefathers, and more practically, an opportunity to establish new communities cheaply, being subsidized by the government and outside dense urban areas. And a few examples of how kind of the West Bank answered two main objectives or sort of desires. One is on a political military level of securing the state and gaining control over these territories and expanding the area of the state, and the other a kind of religious, ideological, sometimes maybe a fundamental sort of desire to go back into this kind of biblical landscape. Here you see a brochure, for example, which is distributed in Brooklyn of a city, Emmanuel, a faithful city in Israel is called, and if you can read here, yes, I can. A united city, yeah, you can raise children in the spirit of ancient Israel. And here another also example of how the stone is used again, sort of extending its far way beyond the area of Jerusalem, but still the Jerusalem stone is applied. But this is one example of many of actually a planned area, a planned settlement that takes part in this larger sort of expansion of the notion of Jerusalem, the notion of sacredness into the West Bank. And it gets, this is Ma'ale Adumim, which is about 15, 20 kilometers from Jerusalem. The settlement project employs diverse means to grab land and gain control over the territories, from top-down approaches of highly planned infrastructure, new towns, neighborhoods, and cities, to bottom-up self-organizing settlements, outposts that emerge from local yet fully coordinated acts on ground. And it is important to distinguish between these different types of planning and urban activities. As I said, some are very well planned and planned by the state, and there is a constant transformation because the more extreme, or sort of what we call the outpost, is really a process that began not so many years ago, maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, although the occupation has been going on for 44 years. So the initial or the beginning were very planned towns, like this one over here, and then gradually there is a process whereby these pre-planned towns send out kind of roads, sort of a kind of outpost or a beginning of a next neighborhood. And this happens on ground, initiated by the settlers. And you can see it happening, so this becomes a kind of strategy out of an existing settlement, which is already established, to extend infrastructure and just throw in a few caravans and start something, grab sort of ground, land. And it's very interesting because, in a way, from the images that you see, at first you would imagine that these agricultural areas belong to the people living here, but that's actually not the case because all the agriculture areas are Palestinian and are cultivated by Palestinians. You see here more examples of that. Some it's even further away. To an extent that it becomes absolutely illogical from any urban point of view, in terms of the relation between the infrastructure and the effort to do all that, to bring a few additional sort of caravans to another hilltop. Again, all these terraces are cultivated land that are being used and worked by Palestinians. What I would like to talk about now is not that type of outpost, that is an extension of an existing settlement or town, but an outpost that emerges of itself out of nowhere, more a kind of active bottom-up by certain settlement groups which have grown more and more. And to show this, here is one example again. These areas are cultivated olive groves. To show this, I'm going to show a short video, which is a report from the Israeli National TV about how one of these sort of outposts came about, and is a fantastic example how sort of the religious groups within the West Bank are operating through religion to gain control over land. A few notes to better understand this video. One is that notes the reporter is a religious Jew. He wears a cap, a knitted cap, which belongs to a certain part of religious Jews which occupy the West Bank. And that allowed him access, in a way, to the material and interviews, etc. Two other important notes. One is a term called, oh yeah, all right, it's 2 minutes. One is a term called minyan, which I mentioned earlier. It's the assembly of 10 Jews in order to pray, to hold a communal prayer. And the other is a mikveh, and this is a bath used for purification of women before they give childbirth and before every once in a month, etc. So please, if you can run the video, please.
עכשיו עוד אנחנו עוברים למאבק על הגבעות. במפות זו סתם גבעה שמספרה 811, בפועל זו עוד התנחלות שקמה בחשאי. שר הביטחון אמנם מצהיר שכל התנחלות טעונה אישור שלו, שר החוץ מוכן לוותר על התנחלויות תמורת ויתור פלסטיני על זכות השיבה, אבל בפועל מאז הבחירות האחרונות קמו על הגבעות ביהודה ושומרון 50 מאחזים חדשים. כתבנו בני ליס עקב במשך שנה וחצי אחר גבעה 811 ומסביר מה הקשר בין הקמת התנחלות לאנטנה סלולרית.
לפני יומיים, לפנות ערב, נכנס זוג צעיר מירושלים לקרוון. גבעה שמספרה 811 נכבשה סופית. ניצחון מושלם. לפני כחצי שנה התחילו ראשי המתנחלים בכיבוש הגבעה הלכה למעשה. על הגבעה הוקם היישוב הגדול ביותר השנה. ליווינו את היישוב מתחילת הקמתו. ההתנחלות הזאת הייתה הסוד השמור ביותר של מתנחלי האזור. וכך התחיל הכל לפי סיפור ראשי המתנחלים. שנים רבות לטשו עיניהם המתנחלים אל הגבעה הזאת. מבחינתם זאת גבעה אסטרטגית, שולטת וחולשת על הכביש לבית אל. אבל לא המינהל האזרחי ולא צה"ל ולא איש אישר להם לעלות לכאן. הם ניסו לעלות משלחת ארכיאולוגית, כפי שעשו בעבר במקומות אחרים, ולא צלחו. הם הורדו מכאן. ואז בשלב מסוים, נוער ההמשך של המתנחלים הגיע אל הגבעה הזאת, תפס במאחז בלתי חוקי, התחבא בתוך חושה במשך ימים ארוכים, אבל הם התחבאו כל כך טוב שאיש בעצם לא ראה שהם נמצאים על הגבעה. לא המינהל האזרחי, לא צה"ל, לא המשטרה, גם אנחנו לא ידענו על קיומם, ובסופו של דבר, כעבור כמה חודשים, הם עזבו את הגבעה ננטשה. ובעקבות זאת, בעלי החיים חזרו לאזור. זמן רב עמד המקום בשיממונו. המתנחלים לא התייאשו וחיפשו כל דרך כדי להעלות על הגבעה. לפני חצי שנה גילינו סימנים ראשונים במקום. מישהו התחיל לחשוף את הקרקע ופרץ דרך. המתנחלים התעוננו על קשיי קליטה בטלפונים הסלולריים, והם יצרו קשר עם חברה. החברה של הטלפונים הסלולריים נענתה והקימה אנטנה על הגבעה שהייתה נטושה, שוממה הגבעה האסטרטגית של המתנחלים. החברה שמחה כנראה שניתנה לה אפשרות להציב את האנטנה ולשפר את השירות. לראשי הציבור היה ברור שזו תחילת הדרך לעלות לגבעה. כולם ראו, כל אחד לשיטתו, בחשיבות האנטנה לגבעה. עם הצבת האנטנה החלו לפרוץ דרכים. לאחר שהיה ברור היטב שאין משאירים גבעה עם אנטנה כל כך יקרה באזור שמועד לפורענות, העלו למקום שומר. שומר עם מחולה. המתנחלים הציבו שומר לאנטנה 24 שעות, וכדי לשמור עליו, התחילו לגדר את המקום. הגדר סבבה את ראש ההר. כעבור זמן, לשומר הייתה בקשה, ולא יוצאת מן הכלל. השומר, שהוא שומר מצוות, בא ואמר, אינני יכול להתפלל אם אין לי מניין בבוקר. ראשי המתנחלים הבינו שקיימת בעיה, והבינו שיש כאן פרצה לסיפור. הסיפור מקבל דחיפה. ערב חג הפסח, במבצע לילי, מוסעים ומונחים הקרוונים בתחומי הגדר. המטרה, לאסוף מניין לשומר. את הקרוונים הניחו בצד ההר, כך שאיש מהנוהגים בכביש לא יוכל לראות אותם, ובייחוד עיניים זרות, כמו תקשורת למשל. יוזם ההתנחלות, ראש המועצה.
אני האחרון המפאיניקים שמאמין שבהתיישבויות לא בכל מקום אנחנו יכולים ליצור מצב שיווצר רצף שצפון ירושלים תגיע לקו של מכמש, כוכב יעקב והגבעות שביניהם. כלומר, הרצון שלי שאזורים מסוימים בתחומי יהודה ושומרון בזכות ההתיישבות יהפכו ללגיטימיים, כן, זאת תפיסת העולם שלי.
פועלים הרומנים שמעסיקה החברה לפיתוח מטה בנימין התחילו לפני כמה שבועות לגדר את תחתית ההר, גידור שמטרתו סימון הטריטוריה. בעוד אלה עסוקים בגדר, עלה לפני שבועיים נושא ההתנחלויות לסדר היום, ועורר סערה תקשורתית ליום אחד. ואלו מקצת שבמקצת, היישובים או המאחזים החדשים. מאחז פלגי מים בבנימין, מאחזים בדרום הר חברון, אביגיל, עשאל, שמעה, מעלה יאיר. מהם מאחזים בני 3 קרוונים ובהם 3 מתנחלים בלבד. יישוב חדש בגוש עציון, נתיב האבות. סך הכל, על פי בכיר ממועצת יש"ע, כ-50 מאחזים בשטחים מאז הבחירות ועד היום. ברוב המאחזים גרים בני הדור השני של המתנחלים.
היות ואני מאמין שאם אני רוצה שחבל ארץ מסוים, שילה לאריאל או עופרה לירושלים, יישאר בריבונות ישראל בכל סיטואציה דמוקרטית, אני צריך ליישב בין השטח הזה את כל השטחים.
בחזרה ליישוב שלנו. בשבוע שעבר עבד כל הלילה הדחפור והכשיר את השטח לקליטת 3 קרוונים שעלו בלילה. קרוונים חדשים, המילה האחרונה. בלילה הכינו את היסודות ל3 קרוונים נוספים. הם הגיעו בלילה שאחרי. הקרוונים שעברו שיפוץ וכניסו במהירות בזוגות צעירים בני מזל שהיו שותפים ראשונים לסוד. מקצתם מהתנחלויות, אחרים מערים בארץ. בשבוע האחרון תכונה רבה. החשמלאים של מטה בנימין עבדו שעות נוספות כדי לחבר את הקרוונים לגנרטור. מפה לאוזן עוברת השמועה כיישוב קולט. זוגות צעירים באים כל העת לבחון, לבדוק ולתפוס קרוון מוצלח עם כיוונים טובים. למתיישבים החדשים כבר חסר מתקן חיוני מאוד על פי ההלכה, ואלה יהיו פני הדברים בקרוב. ליישוב אין מגדל מים, והוא התחבר לקו המים הראשי. הם הגיעו לראשי המתנחלים ואמרו, יש לנו כבר מניין, הכל כבר מתחיל להיות בסדר, גנרטור כבר קיים, גדר כבר קיימת, תאורה כבר קיימת, אנחנו כבר שומרים במקום, חסר לנו מקווה. וכאן הסיפור עובד לפי מקומות אחרים כפי שראינו אותם. את המקווה ראינו במאחז גבעת אסף הסמוך, פטנט שאין שני לו בעולם. על פי החוק, אסור לבנות בתוך הקרקע ביישוב שאין לו הרשאה לבנייה קשיחה. ולפיכך נמצא פתרון הנדסי על פי ההלכה. מרימים קרוון, קותחים חור ברצפתו, יוצקים מתחתיו ריבוע בטון, ובתוכו נאגרים המים. המתנחלים מכנים אותו מקווה גבעות. טיולי משפחות לעת ערב ביישוב החדש. הם באים לראות את הדיירים שמגיעים מירושלים. וזה סדר הדברים. בלילה מעלים קרוונים, למחרת נכנסים המתנחלים החדשים. איש מהם אינו רוצה להתראיין. על פי הוראה, כולם סוחרים את פיהם. תחושה של ראשוניות, של להיות ראשון.
אני לא. אני אחלוק את זה עם חברותיי. לא נעים לנו שמצלמים.
שאנחנו פה?
לא, שמצלמים אותם.
אין עניין. תודה.
עד סוף השנה מתוכננות להתאכלס כאן עשרות משפחות נוספות. ביישוב החדש שבחבל בנימין על כביש עוקף רמאללה. אחד המתכננים ובוני המקום שמקורב מאוד לשלטון אמר לראשי המתנחלים שהראו סימני מצוקה לעתיד ההתנחלות הזו, אל דאגה אמר, אנו בנקודת אל חזור. לאחר 5 חודשים 12 משפחות מאכלסות. שם ניתן ליישוב, שם מקראי, מגרון. על הגבעה הזאת אולי חנה סנחרב בעת מסעו לכיבוש ירושלים. מגרון, התנחלות חדשה שעלתה לקרקע בזכותה ובחסותה של אנטנה סלולרית.
Go back to the PowerPoint for a minute, for a concluding slide. Hill number 811 exemplifies the process of sacredizing space as religious activity, transform an apparent non-place, a number on an army map, to a site embedded with a biblical story. As examples of the West Bank shows, outside the urban context, religious conviction appropriates a territory far beyond the boundaries of a particular building lot. Outside the city, the frontiers of the West Bank offers an expansive site yet to be conquered. Whether hilltops, agricultural lands, or areas inhabited by the native other, every site within this territory can be reimagined as a place of religious significance. Its occupation expresses the enactment of religious belief, which in turn fuels its further growth. Thank you.
Okay. And thank you very much. I would like now to invite Laman Sana, the D. Willis James Professor of Missions and World Christianity and Professor of History at Yale University, to offer a response.
Thank you very much. When Carla invited me to this conference, I told her that I knew nothing about the subject. But she said, well, she thought I had something to say. I will have something to say, but I'm afraid I'm something of an interloper. By training, I'm a historian of religion, and I spent most of my life studying the religious thought of Islam. And I thought I should really begin, if you may allow me, time is short. I'll try to make very brief points, 3 brief points, in the way of raising questions. I arrived in Beirut on the aftermath of the 1967 war. It was an exhilarating time. There was a lot of ferment in the air. I was a student at the American University of Beirut, AUB. And it was clear to me when I looked around my fellow students and others that the Six-Day War had left Arab politics, Middle East politics, in chaos. The leader of the militant Palestinian faction, George Habash, reasoned and persuaded Yasser Arafat to agree that a new anti-Israeli struggle was needed to replace the discredited policy of Gamal Abdel Nasser. By the way, Nasser had sent agents to Beirut, one of whom I knew, Amar. For that strategy, Jordan must first be taken over to thwart what Habash called reactionary Arab regimes willing to do the bidding of Israel and the United States. That calculation made Israel and Jordan equal targets of Palestinian fury, and eventually would engulf Lebanon. There was, as I understood it, a fine-tuned mechanism of representation in parliament and in the leadership structure, which has very long established religious communities sharing power. With the influx of Palestinian refugees, AUB actually was experiencing student disturbances, not on the scale. Eventually that would overwhelm it, but certainly it was there in 1968 and 1969. It was clear that strains were beginning to appear, especially on Lebanon's southern border. The seeds then of the bitter civil war of 1975 were sown, if you like, in the roughed up soil of dislocated refugees flocking into Lebanon at the time. I should say, by the way, that when I was growing up in West Africa, we had Lebanese traders as our neighbors, one of whom married into my family on my mother's side. And they spoke our language, and we knew a great deal about Middle Eastern music through these friends. So Lebanon was really, in a sense, very much part of our makeup in that part of West Africa. In any case, I was very curious about the role of religion, as an historian of religion, the role of religion in Lebanon's life. The friends I knew were convinced that Lebanon would be exempt from the troubles of its neighbors, and that even if there are obstacles and occasional breakdowns among observers, they were convinced that the prospects of strife were remote. I remember a wonderful occasion meeting some of the major religious leaders of Lebanon at a major conference in Brumana, in those days an exhilarating mountain setting. They were full of confidence that the religious harmony which had characterized Lebanon's history would secure Lebanon's security and prosperity. But of course, we now know what happened. I left Lebanon in 1972, and of course 3 years later the Civil War broke. I used to have nightmares about the Civil War, again because Lebanon was so close to my feelings. I used to have nightmares about the war. And a couple of years later, I was actually invited back to Lebanon as a professor, which I couldn't, I was advised not to take because the Civil War was impending. I've never been able to go back to Lebanon for that reason. And some of the slides, pictures, photographs I've seen made me realize that I probably would not recognize Beirut today. The really fundamental question, since a lot has been said about religion, is in some ways Lebanon, as I understood it, was the gift of religion, but also the curse of religion. The special place in the religious history of Lebanon, I felt, had lessons also for the West, but that's something else, and we can talk about that. Recently, much more recently, in fact, only a month, 2 months ago, I went on a trip to Saudi Arabia, which was sponsored by the Saudi government. It was a trip actually publicized by the monarchy in a royal decree. The invitation came to me from Prince Turki Al Faisal, who used to be the Saudi ambassador to the United Kingdom and also later to the United States. And the visit went according to plan. I was invited and I asked if I could bring my students from Yale, and the Saudis agreed, so a party of 14 set out from New Haven. We arrived in Riyadh. It was an extraordinary experience. There's no time to relate it. I took over 500 photographs, which I haven't edited yet. But since we're a group of Yale Divinity School students and Yale Law School students with very deep interest in the image and the reputation of Saudi Arabia as a Wahhabi-based state, we were quite amazed by what we saw. I suppose 2 places stood out in this regard. One was the Museum of Modern Science in Riyadh, and I would encourage anyone and everyone to visit the Museum of Modern Science, especially if you are from the United States. because it was clear in the Museum of Modern Science that the Saudis had embraced modern science without qualification. There is no inherent conflict or fear of Darwinian evolution whatsoever. In other words, the museum never tinkered with the scientific evidence. What it did, however, was to enfold scientific artifacts in Quranic quotations. Quite striking. And my students were struck by this, coming from the United States, where the whole idea of evolution and creation have become political hot potatoes, but not in Saudi Arabia. The second institution, structure, beautiful building, which houses the Royal Library next, apparently, to the palace of the king. We visited on the day that I think the king was in residence. But the library was amazing, because one of the highlights of the library was a center dedicated to children's books. And it was done in such a way that children actually came there and they had programs and projects for them. And then they had another section dealing with research and the women's section of the library. And again, it impressed the students that the Saudis' conception of library design and production should have as a center stage a special project for children. The question is this. We talked yesterday and also part of today about Islam and the nation state. And I suppose Saudi Arabia must be the poster country, the poster child of the triumph of religion over the nation state. Or is it? You think of the Saudi flag, and on the flag you have the Shahada, the Kalima, the declaration of faith. And then under the declaration of faith, you have the sword. That's the national flag. And for me, that represented kind of the tension there is between national sovereignty and divine sovereignty. And in a sense, it has not been resolved, nor do I think the Saudis interested in resolving that tension. But one of the places we were taken to on the escort was the Naif Arab University for Security Sciences. I don't know if anyone has been there. It's the Saudi CIA, FBI combined. And the Saudis are very interested in what they call the international dimensions of confronting terrorism. Actually, at the time of our visit, they were busy with the Yemeni issue. And international cooperation to deal with terrorism assumes a certain respect for national states, for nation states. I didn't learn from that. The Saudis were interested in co-opting a kind of territorial aggrandizement, in co-opting states into the Saudi scheme. And let me go back to nation state and Islam in another way. It seems to me that fundamentalism, we saw pictures yesterday, Islamic fundamentalism, you could say has given reform in Islam a bad name. By reform, I mean tajdeed. We saw the chart where, in a sense, you move, you have taqleed, ijtihad, and taqleed as a kind of bipolar. But in fact, in between is tajdeed, the process of peaceful reform. And here, let me finish with an anecdote. After Beirut, I was trying to figure out what to do for graduate school. And some of you would know, I hope, Albert Hourani at Oxford at St. Anthony's College, whom I went to visit. Wonderful guy, made me a cup of tea. And then I went to SOAS, School of Oriental African Studies, where there was a much greater concentration of scholars in the field. And they asked me what did I want to do. By the way, they said, new historical sources are being discovered on jihad studies, jihad in Islam, radical reform, long before 9/11. I thought about it for a second, and I thought, you know, it doesn't seem plausible to me as an historian to think that people embrace and maintain Islam on the basis of coercion and force. That just doesn't make sense. So I said to my professor, I'd like to study an aspect of Islam which shows the capacity of Islam to transmit its ideas and values, if you like, in civil society. And to cut a long story short, I ended up writing, for my sins, probably the only study of the pacifist movement in Islam, looking at a small community of African Muslims about whom nothing had been written or much. And I was quite astonished to find that they had a history going back 700 years of refusal to take up arms to spread Islam. And for me, it gave tajdeed, the idea of peaceful reform, a kind of historical solidity. I could actually document with chapter and verse who these people were, how they were related, where they went to, where they traveled. And we found Arabic chronicles documents going back, in one case, the Asl al-Wangarayin goes back to the 15th century. And there are references in earlier sources, Al-Umari, Kitab al-Masalik al-Mamalik, and other sources refer to, and Ahmad Baba of Timbuktu, then in Morocco, actually describes this community in the early 1603. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the expressions of Islam that we saw in the wonderful architectural styles, showing the variety and the dynamism, these expressions are also reflected in the internal dynamism of Islam. And I would encourage us, perhaps, again as an historian only, to think of the possibilities Muslims have created necessarily, even if you take the madahib, the Sharia sources in Islam. I remind my students, one of the most amazing things about the madahib is that none of the founders of the madahib were employees of the state. All of them suffered at the hands of the caliphate, all of them. And if you read the history, the story of Malik had his arms pulled apart until his shoulders dislocated because he refused to surrender his conscience. And the same thing with Hanafi, the Hanafi school. He was actually tortured in Baghdad. He was bleeding for 21 days before the caliph had him poisoned, and he died. And there were riots, demonstrations in Baghdad. The point I'm trying to make is that it's a very, very complex religious movement, and therefore we have to look at it with nuanced eyes. And finally, since Christianity has come up, let me make three statements about Christianity vis-a-vis Islam. In Islam, we have the Quran. This is the Quran that Muslims have worshipped from for the past 1,400 years. It's in the Arabic of the Prophet, and the worship enshrines it in the habits and lives of Muslims. Christianity, on the other hand, is the only major religion that is propagated without the language of the founder of the religion. Christians do not know the language of Jesus, they don't pray in it, they don't care. In other words, Christianity is necessarily a translated religion. The Gospels we have in the Koine Greek is not the language in which Jesus preached, which means, therefore, that Christianity is necessarily translated, because translation also involves interpretation. The second thing to say is that Christians in America, Americans want to go back to original Christianity. But if you ask them what is original Christianity, they have a very hard time saying, except the statement that if the King James Bible was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for them. It's an amazing thing, because the King James Bible, published in 1611, when the Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth Colony, not one of them in 1621 had a copy of the King James with them. It was still a translation that was not accepted by the devout faithful. It's a translation. And this means, therefore, that wherever you find Christianity, it's always in a language other than the one in which Jesus preached and taught and prayed. And Christianity doesn't have a birthplace to that extent. And when we try to get a birthplace for Christianity back to Jerusalem and Bethlehem, the Crusades erupted. It's very strange, whereas Mecca is central to Islam's territorial integrity as a religion, as a faith. And the final thing to say about translation is that very often my friends say to me, in fact, George Bush made a statement which was very controversial, that Muslims and Christians worship the same God, and he got pounced on by the religious right. And there are still debates going on about that. But I remind my students that the word God was Anglo-Saxon for a pagan warrior. It's a translator. Jesus would not know the word God if he heard it, because it's a translation. And this theological shift means that Christianity is necessarily localized wherever you find it. And today, over 3,000 languages are involved in the promotion and development of Christianity. Tremendous variety, tremendous complexity. And I would say Islam is also complex, but in a very, very different way. And bringing these two religions together in that way helps to illuminate not only what they have in common, but the tremendous contrast that can be very instructive about not leaping to conclusions. So my comments is basically to say, as an historian of religion, let us give more credit to the dynamism and the complexity of the religious life and the religious conception, which is often expressed through material forms and symbols. Thank you.
Okay, we have a very vigorous afternoon ahead of us, so if we could now break for lunch and be back here at 1:30, please. Thank you.